The morning Cara Morales found the door, she had $47 in her checking account, and a final notice from her landlord folded into the back pocket of her work pants. She'd read it so many times that the paper had gone soft at the creases, the ink slightly blurred where her thumb kept running across the same line. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. 14 days. That was how long the property management company was giving her before they started eviction proceedings. 14 days to come up with $1,840 she did not have and had no clear path to getting. She pulled on borrowed work boots in the dark of her kitchen. They were 2 sizes too large, and she'd packed the toes with folded newspaper the way she had every morning for the past 3 weeks, ever since her own pair had split open at the sole during a meridian job in a drainage corridor on the south side of the city. The boots belonged to a woman named Dolores who ran inventory at the maintenance depot and had noticed Cara limping through the parking lot 2 days after it happened. Nobody made a big deal of it. Dolores had dropped the boots on Cara's locker shelf with a yellow sticky note that said only fits. And that was the end of it. That was the kind of problem Cara solved without drama, quietly, before anyone noticed how serious it had gotten. Her son, Marco, was 7 and asleep in the next room. She stood in his doorway for a moment before leaving, long enough to watch the rise and fall of his breathing. He slept with one arm thrown over his head and his mouth slightly open, the way he had since he was an infant. The plastic glow stars she'd stuck to his ceiling 2 Christmases ago had lost most of their charge, barely registering now. Just the faintest green smear against the plaster when the room was dark enough. She did not wake him. She never did this early. He had school, and he needed the sleep. And anyway, what she felt standing there in the doorway watching him breathe was not the kind of thing she put into words. She wrote a note and left it on the kitchen counter. Cereal in the cupboard. Mrs. Vega has the key. Back by 6. Love, Mom. Then she locked the door behind her and walked 4 blocks to the bus stop in the cold. Cara had been working maintenance subcontracts for the city going on 3 years. The work came in batches, irregular and unpredictable, routed through a small company called Meridian Infrastructure Solutions, which was the kind of name that meant nothing specific and covered everything uncomfortable. Meridian handled the jobs the larger city contractors did not want, the inspections of infrastructure nobody thought about until something went wrong. Aging drainage corridors, ventilation shafts that had not been reviewed in decades, underground utility runs in parts of the city built so long ago that the original drawings had been lost and redrawn from memory. The pay was hourly, $18.40, which was not enough, but was more than she'd made the year before, and the work was consistent enough that she could usually count on 30 to 35 hours a week. She'd taken the job after the restaurant where she'd waitressed for 4 years changed ownership, and the new manager cut her shifts in half for reasons he never explained directly. She applied to 6 other places. One called back. Meridian. She hadn't expected to be good at it. She had no background in civil engineering or construction. What she had was the ability to follow precise instructions, a tolerance for tight spaces and poor lighting, and a work ethic her grandmother had described once as almost frightening. Her grandmother had meant it as a compliment. She'd grown up on the east side of the city, in a neighborhood that had been called a lot of things over the decades depending on who was doing the calling. Her mother had cleaned offices downtown for most of Cara's childhood, leaving before sunrise and coming back smelling of floor wax and window cleaner, making dinner at 8 o'clock with the speed that came from doing the same thing for years. Her father had been largely absent in ways that shifted between physical and emotional without ever fully resolving into one or the other. Cara had been 17 when she found out she was pregnant with Marco. She'd been 22 when the relationship she'd thought would make things easier instead fell apart over money and resentment and the slow erosion of goodwill. She'd raised Marco since then with her mother's help and a level of calculation that surprised her sometimes. Every dollar tracked, every bill scheduled, every emergency accounted for, until the emergencies got too expensive to account for. 3 months before the morning she found the door, her mother had a stroke. She survived it, but she was in a care facility now, and the cost of that, even partially covered by Medicaid, had disrupted every financial calculation Cara had spent years building. She'd taken on extra Meridian shifts where she could get them. She'd sold her car. She was behind on rent. This is where she was, $47, borrowed boots, an eviction notice, a son in school, and a job that took her underground. The assignment that morning had come through the Meridian dispatcher the previous evening. A routine inspection of transit infrastructure. Specifically, the lower-level tunnel network in a section of the city that had been built during a period of rapid expansion in the 1930s and 1940s and then gradually abandoned as transportation priorities shifted. The Transit Authority still technically owned the tunnels. They appeared in the city's infrastructure database as decommissioned, inactive, pending future assessment. That last phrase had been pending for approximately 60 years. Cara's job was straightforward on paper. Walk a designated section of the tunnel network, document the condition of the walls and ceiling, check for evidence of water intrusion or structural compromise, photograph anything that looked like a hazard, and submit a report to Meridian by end of week. There was a building going up 3 blocks from the tunnel entrance, and the adjacent construction project required verification that the old tunnels would not collapse into the new foundation. That was why the inspection was happening now. She'd done this kind of job before. Different tunnels, different infrastructure, same basic procedure. She knew how to read the signs of a tunnel under stress and how to document what she found in the format Meridian required. She had a headlamp, a backup flashlight, a clipboard with the designated route map, a camera, and a respirator in case the air quality turned out to be an issue. She did not expect to find anything unusual. The entrance was a steel door set into a wall in the basement of a transit authority maintenance building on the edge of the old commercial district. A man in his 50s named Gerald who worked the morning desk had the key. He handed it over without ceremony, logging her entry in a clipboard of his own and telling her to be back by noon because he went to lunch at noon and he was not leaving the door unlocked. The tunnel on the other side of that steel door was not as dark as she expected. Emergency lighting, the old fluorescent strip kind, still functioned at intervals along the ceiling, casting the space in a pale yellow that was barely better than darkness, but was something. The air was cool and dry, which was a good sign. Dry meant the waterproofing above had held at least partially. She could hear the faint vibration of the city above, muffled and rhythmic, the way a heartbeat sounds through a pillow. She moved through the corridor at a steady pace, photographing the walls every 20 feet, noting cracks and moisture stains in the checkpoint format Meridian used. The concrete was old but not obviously compromised. Some hairline cracking consistent with age and settling. No active water intrusion she could see. The ceiling was intact. The floor was clear of debris except for the occasional cluster of old junction hardware that had been removed from the walls and left on the ground, probably decades ago, by someone who intended to come back for it and never did. The designated route took her roughly 400 meters south, then a turn east for another 200, then a junction where she was supposed to document the condition of a branching corridor before turning back. She'd estimated an hour and a half for the full route. She moved at a pace that let her actually look at what she was photographing. She was 150 meters into the south corridor when she noticed the discrepancy. It was not dramatic. Nothing about it announced itself. She had her clipboard open to the route map, checking her position against the marked waypoints, and she realized that the distance between 2 waypoints did not match the physical distance she'd walked. The map showed the east junction roughly 100 meters from the entrance branch. She'd walked at least 120, probably 130. The corridor kept going. There was no junction. She stopped, checked the map again. Her position was clearly marked. The corridor dimensions on the map matched the physical space she was standing in. But the junction was not where it should be. She walked another 10 meters, studying the west wall, and found the problem. Or rather, she found what was hiding it. At some point, the west wall had been bricked over. New brick, meaning newer than the surrounding concrete, though still old enough to be stained and dusty and visually continuous with everything around it if you were not looking closely. Someone had matched the color deliberately, using mortar tinted to approximate the gray of aged concrete. At a glance, at the pace of someone just passing through, it looked like a wall. Cara stood close enough to notice the seam where the brick met the original concrete, a line too regular to be a crack, running floor to ceiling about 4 feet to her left. She measured the expanse of bricked wall with her tape measure, roughly 12 feet wide. She pressed her palm against it and felt nothing different from the concrete sections on either side. She knocked gently, her knuckles against the brick, and heard the sound change at the midpoint, slightly less solid. The faintest hollowness in the return. She photographed the wall. She photographed the seam. She measured the extent of the brick and marked it on her clipboard with a note. Undocumented wall modification. West corridor, approximately 130 meters from entrance. Then she continued to the east junction, documented what she found there, turned around, and went back out. Gerald was at his desk when she returned, drinking coffee from a styrofoam cup. He took the key back without looking up. She filed her photographs and written notes that night after Marco was in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop and the Meridian reporting portal. She included the wall modification in her documentation, described it precisely, and uploaded the photographs. Then she waited. The response came 48 hours later. An email from the Meridian project coordinator, a man named Phil who managed the transit authority contracts from a shared office somewhere downtown. His message was brief. Hi, Cara. Appreciate the thorough work as always. The West Corridor Wall Notation Transit Authority says this is a pre-existing modification, nothing to be concerned about. I'm going ahead and marking that item closed. Let me know if there's anything else. She read it 3 times. She'd been working with Meridian long enough to understand the shape of an answer designed to close rather than explain. Pre-existing modification was not an explanation. It was a category. It told her the wall had been modified at some point in the past. It told her nothing about why or when or what was on the other side. She also understood that the transit authority had received her report, had seen the photographs, and had chosen to characterize the finding as nothing to be concerned about without providing any supporting documentation. That was a choice. Choices meant something. She did not reply to Phil's email. She went to work the following day, picked up Marco from school, made dinner, helped with homework, got through a bath and a bedtime story about a dog who wanted to be an astronaut, and sat on her couch in the quiet apartment thinking. The next morning, she went back. She hadn't planned to. That was what she told herself on the bus to the maintenance building. She hadn't planned it. But she'd brought her tools, and when Gerald handed her the key, she'd asked for another entry permit, citing a follow-up verification, which was something Meridian contractors were allowed to do within 48 hours of a primary inspection. Gerald handed her a new log sheet without any particular interest. She went straight to the bricked section. Standing in front of it again, she felt the same stillness she'd felt during her first visit, the way certain situations pressed themselves flat against the noise of ordinary thought and made the world go quiet. She ran her fingers along the seam a second time and found what she'd missed on the first pass. Low on the wall, near the floor, partially obscured by the accumulation of dust along the baseboard, was a small steel plate, 4 inches by 4 inches. Flush with the brick surface, its edges recessed, its face blank except for a round keyhole at the center. She photographed it. Then she sat down on the corridor floor, back against the opposite wall, and thought about what a 4-inch steel plate with a keyhole said about what was behind the brick. Someone had built a way in. They'd bricked over the entrance and then installed a lock. Not a modern lock. The keyhole design was old, the kind she associated with the same era as the original tunnel construction, a barrel-type mechanism with a heavy spring. The plate itself was old too, surface oxidation suggesting it had been there as long as the brick. Whoever had sealed this section of the tunnel had done it carefully. They'd matched the wall. They'd installed a hidden mechanism. They'd made sure that casual inspection would pass right by. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Cara sat in that corridor for 20 minutes. She was thinking about her $47 and her eviction notice. She was thinking about Marco's glow stars going dark on his ceiling. She was thinking about the shape of a decision that could not be undone once it was made. She was also thinking about the wall itself. About the fact that someone had bricked over a section of a city-owned tunnel, installed a hidden lock, and the transit authority had apparently accepted the characterization of pre-existing modification and added it to their records and not investigated further. Either they did not know what it meant, or they did know, and they had decided the same thing Phil had decided. Closed. Nothing to be concerned about. She pulled out her phone and searched. The tunnel network she was inspecting was part of a system built during rapid urban expansion. She found historical transit authority records online, partial, mostly from secondary sources, that described the network's original scope. The South Corridor had been part of an ambitious extension project. She found that language in a digitized planning document from 1941, that included a dedicated station at the junction of two major routes. A station that, according to the planning documents, had been completed and briefly used before being removed from the official network in 1944. The reason given in the historical record was operational consolidation. The station was not mentioned in any later transit authority record she could find. It had been built, apparently used briefly, and then removed from the maps. The physical space, presumably, had remained. Concrete and steel did not dissolve because they were no longer administratively acknowledged. She thought about the corridor running 12 feet behind the brick. Wide enough for a platform. Wide enough for a station. She went back to Gerald's desk before the end of her permitted inspection window and returned the key. He logged her out. She thanked him. She did not mention the steel plate. Over the next 2 weeks, she went 3 more times. Each visit, she spent longer at the brick wall. She photographed every inch of it. She measured the keyhole with a digital caliper borrowed from the depot toolbox. She searched transit authority records online with the kind of patience that comes from having something to prove to yourself. She read digitized newspaper archives from the 1940s. She made lists. Certain things emerged from that research. The station was mentioned once in a local newspaper from March 1943, in a brief article about transit expansion that described it as the newly completed Harmon Street Lower Station, currently being assessed for passenger service. The article included 2 details she wrote down and circled. First, the station had been built deeper than the main network, accessed by a dedicated branch corridor rather than the existing line. Second, the City Transit Authority had entered into a wartime agreement with a federal logistics agency to use portions of the city's transit infrastructure for secure transport operations. That phrase, secure transport operations, appeared in one other place. A brief reference in a congressional appropriations ledger from 1944, digitized and posted by a university archive, that allocated funds for the closure of civilian transport facilities used in wartime logistics programs. The specific line read, "Closure of Harmon Street Auxiliary Facility per Protocol 7, completed November 1944. She stared at the words ceiling for a long time. She did not go back to the tunnel for 2 weeks after that. She paid what she could on the rent, negotiated an extension with the property management company that bought her another 30 days, picked up 2 extra meridian shifts, and spent her evenings at the kitchen table pulling on threads. Protocol 7. She searched every variation she could construct. Federal wartime logistics. Transit auxiliary facilities. 1944 closures. Most of what she found was either too vague to be useful or clearly unrelated. But one document, a declassified report from the Office of War Transport, mentioned protocol designations applied to facilities that had been used for the temporary storage of strategic assets during periods of national emergency. The report's language was deliberately oblique, the kind of bureaucratic writing that says something without quite saying it. But strategic assets was a phrase with known meaning. In the wartime context she was looking at, it had specific application. She thought about the sealed station. She thought about a federal agency using it for secure transport operations in 1943 and 1944. She thought about it being sealed in November 1944, 10 months before the end of the war in Europe. She thought about what might still be inside. The problem was the lock. She had no key and no mechanism to replicate one without knowing the exact specifications of the barrel. She spent a week thinking about this, then 2 days actually doing something about it. She'd learned locksmithing in the same way she'd learned most practical things, out of necessity and then out of interest. She'd taken a 2-week course 3 years earlier when she was briefly considering whether she could make more money doing property turnover work. She hadn't pursued it, but she remembered what she'd learned, and she had a small locksmith kit she'd bought for the course and never returned to its case. The 4th time she visited the tunnel, she spent 90 minutes on that keyhole. Gerald's record would show her completing a standard follow-up inspection. She timed it carefully. She had just enough window. The lock was old but not rusted. Whatever the mechanism was, it had been maintained at some point after installation, or the environment of the corridor had been dry enough to preserve it. The barrel turned harder than a modern lock, but it turned. She felt it engage, then disengage, and then with a sound she would remember for the rest of her life, a low, heavy, resonant click that seemed to travel through the floor and up through her feet and into her chest. The mechanism released. She pressed both palms flat against the brick, and with a weight she hadn't expected, a 4-foot section swung inward on a concealed hinge. The air that came out of the space beyond was not stale in the way she'd expected. It was cool and dry, the same temperature as the corridor, the same lack of odor. Whatever was on the other side had been sealed well enough to maintain its interior climate for the better part of 8 decades. She turned on her headlamp and stepped through. The brick was 18 inches thick. She could tell by how long the doorway took to move through. On the other side was a corridor, wider than the one she'd come from, with a ceiling 4 feet higher and walls lined with tiled work in a cream and brown geometric pattern. Transit tiles, the same style used in stations across the city from the same period. She recognized them from photographs she'd seen in historical archives. The tiles were intact, every single one of them, not a single one cracked or missing. They caught her headlamp and gave the light back clean, like someone had cleaned them the week before. The corridor was perhaps 30 feet long. At the end of it, a short flight of concrete steps led downward, edged with a worn iron railing. At the base of the steps, spreading out in both directions, was the platform. It was a proper station. Not large, not a mainline hub, but complete and intact in a way that stopped her at the top of the steps. The platform extended 60, maybe 70 feet in both directions. The ceiling was vaulted, tiled in the same geometric pattern as the corridor, but with an additional band of black and white mosaic running along the upper edge. At either end of the platform, signage was mounted on the wall in the style of transit authority standard from the 1940s. The signage read Harmon Street. The benches were still in place. Wooden slat benches bolted to the platform floor, their surfaces covered with a fine layer of dust so thin it looked more like a patina than real accumulation. The overhead lighting was off, no power reaching this section, but her headlamp was enough to fill the space with shadow and detail. She turned slowly, taking in every corner of it. Nothing had been disturbed. Nothing had been vandalized or scavenged or allowed to degrade beyond the slow action of time in a sealed space. No one had been here. No one had stood on this platform since the last person left and sealed the brick behind them. She walked the length of the platform, her footsteps the only sound, the faint click of her boots against the concrete raising a hollow echo that vanished quickly in the sealed air. At the far end, she found the station's service booth, a small room with a ticket window of old ribbed glass, the register still inside and empty, and a rack of hooks on the wall where a coat and a set of keys still hung. She stood and looked at the keys for a long moment. A transit authority identification tag, the kind issued to station staff. The name on the tag was worn past reading. She stood back and swept her headlamp across the far wall of the platform, past the service booth, toward the tunnel mouth at the north end of the station where the track disappeared into darkness. And then she saw the train. It was not the first thing she'd noticed because the north end was dark and she'd been focused on the platform itself. But as she walked toward the tunnel mouth, as the beam of her headlamp reached further into the shadow, she saw the shape of it. A locomotive, old, a type she associated with mid-century transit photographs, sitting on the track at the head of a small consist. 2 cargo cars behind it, all 3 stationary, apparently intact, the locomotive's front end just barely visible at the platform edge as though it had arrived and stopped and simply never left. She stepped close to the platform edge and crouched, bringing her headlamp level with the side of the first cargo car. The car was sealed. Wooden slats over a metal frame, the seams between slats filled with a weatherproof compound. Every door was secured with a padlock, the same barrel type as the one on the brick wall outside, and they were covered with a second layer of metal banding that had been welded across the door frame. Someone had not merely locked these cars. They had sealed them, specifically, deliberately, and with the kind of care that said the contents were meant to stay where they were until someone came back for them. No one, apparently, had come back. She checked the locomotive cab, standing on the footplate to look through the glass. The instrument panel was intact, gauges and levers still in their positions. A logbook was visible on the small shelf to the left of the main control cluster. She could not reach it through the glass. The cab door was locked. She stepped back down to the platform and stood with her headlamp off for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to whatever ambient darkness remained. She could see nothing. The station was as sealed and lightless as the inside of a box. She turned her headlamp back on and thought. 2 cargo cars, sealed with welded metal banding. a station that did not exist on current transit maps, a federal wartime protocol calling for the sealing of facilities used for strategic asset transport, a lock on the entrance that had been functional, that had opened. She thought about the 1943 newspaper article, Secure Transport Operations. She thought about strategic assets. She stood there in the dark of a station that had not existed, officially, for almost 80 years, listening to the silence, and felt something move in her chest that was not quite hope and not quite fear. It was recognition, the sense of a thing sealed up in the dark, waiting for someone with the patience to find it and the nerve to see what was inside. She turned her headlamp back to the cargo cars and took photographs of everything. The platform, the benches, the service booth with its code on the hook, the logbook behind the locomotive glass, the cargo cars with their welded banding. She documented it with the same care she brought to every inspection, the same precision, the same refusal to miss a detail. She was shaking slightly by the time she went back through the brick door. Not from cold. She sealed the door behind her, the hidden lock engaging with the same heavy click, and walked back up the corridor toward the entrance and the city above her and the world she was trying to hold together with borrowed boots and $47 and an eviction notice and a boy with fading glow stars on his ceiling. She handed Gerald his key. She sat on the bus home and did not open her phone. She looked out the window at the city moving past, all of it completely ordinary, completely unaware that 200 feet below a section of the street she passed over every week, a train was sitting in the dark on a track that did not appear on any map, sealed and waiting, carrying something that had once been important enough to warrant an entire federal protocol. She thought about what she knew and what she did not. She knew the station existed. She'd been inside it. She knew the train existed. She'd touched the side of the cargo car and felt the cold metal under her palm. She knew the sealing had been intentional, official, and old. She knew the transit authorities' response to her initial documentation had been to categorize and close without explanation. What she did not know was what was in those cargo cars. But she was going to find out. That night, after Marco was in bed and the apartment was quiet, Cara sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and a legal pad and wrote down everything she had in the order she had it. The station had been built in 1943. She had newspaper documentation of that. It had been used for secure transport operations under a wartime agreement with a federal logistics agency. She had the appropriations ledger reference for that. It had been sealed in November 1944 under Protocol 7. She had the declassified Office of War Transport reference for that. And behind the brick, a complete station, untouched, with a train and 2 sealed cargo cars. She looked at what she'd written and added a question at the bottom of the page. What was being transported? She spent the next 4 hours reading. The history of wartime transport logistics was not a subject she'd ever thought about before. But she found enough, through digitized historical records, university archive databases, and secondary accounts, to start building a picture. During the Second World War, the federal government had used urban transit infrastructure in several major American cities to move high-value assets. The general reason was security. Surface routes were vulnerable to observation and interception. Underground systems offered concealment and reliability. The transit networks of several major cities had been quietly integrated into a wartime logistics network that operated largely outside public awareness. What were the assets? She found references to currency reserves, to rare materials, to items the government was moving out of storage facilities it considered vulnerable. The more specific documents were still classified or simply not available in digitized form. But the pattern she could see was clear enough. The government had used sealed sections of urban transit infrastructure to store and transport things it did not want visible, during a period when visibility meant risk. She read about a specific program, referenced in an academic paper focused on wartime economic policy, that described the consolidation of gold reserves from regional federal depositories into more secure centralized storage during the period 1942 to 1945. The program had been managed through the Treasury Department's Division of Monetary Affairs. Several transit-based transfer operations had been used to move consolidated reserves, particularly in cities where the rail infrastructure allowed sealed car transport between secure facilities. She stopped reading. Gold reserves. Transit-based transfer operations. A sealed station in a city with an extensive underground transit network. 2 sealed cargo cars. A federal protocol for closure in November 1944. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. She was aware of the difference between a chain of suggestive facts and a conclusion. She knew that what she'd found might be empty cars, sealed for reasons having nothing to do with gold. A logistical operation that had transferred its assets long before the protocol sealed the doors, and that the sealing itself was nothing more than the closing of an empty room. She also knew that the welded metal banding across the cargo doors was not the work of someone who'd already removed what was inside. You did not add a second layer of security to an empty car. You did not seal the entrance to a station with hidden mechanisms and matching brick if there was nothing behind it worth protecting. She went to bed at 2 in the morning and lay awake until 4. The next day, she went to the city records office. She told herself this was research, not commitment. She was gathering information. She had not made any decision about what to do with what she'd found. For now, she was just looking. The city records office was a room on the 4th floor of a building downtown that smelled of old paper and institutional carpet. She requested Historical Transit Authority documentation for the period 1940 to 1950 and sat at a reading table while a staff member brought out 2 archival boxes. Most of what she found confirmed what she already knew. The transit system had expanded significantly in the early 1940s. Several lines had been partially rerouted or extended. The general administrative records from that period were intact but dense, full of the kind of operational detail that was genuinely unintelligible without context. Then she found a file that should not have been in the box. It was a single-page, thin carbon paper with faded typewriter text, tucked between 2 heavier documents without a folder or tab of its own. The header at the top read Office of Treasury Coordination, followed by a date in October 1944. Below the header, in formal bureaucratic language that had been typed carefully enough to suggest someone had proofread it twice, was a transfer confirmation. It confirmed the receipt and secure placement of transport cargo pursuant to Program Directive 18G into Harmon Street Auxiliary as of October 14, 1944. The cargo was described as consolidated reserve material, quantity as per manifest attached. The confirmation was signed by 2 individuals whose names were followed by agency designations she did not recognize, and countersigned by someone identified only as Transit Authority Liaison, whose signature was illegible. Manifest attached. She looked through every page in the box twice. There was no manifest. She documented the page with her phone camera from 3 angles, returned the boxes, and left the building. On the bus home, she stared at the photograph on her phone screen. Consolidated reserve material. In the context of the wartime gold consolidation program she'd read about, that phrase had a specific meaning. She thought about the weight of a gold bar. A standard gold bar, the kind held in Federal Reserves, weighed approximately 27 pounds. Worth, at current market rates, somewhere in the neighborhood of $700,000. 2 sealed cargo cars. She thought about what 2 sealed cargo cars could hold. She put her phone in her pocket and looked out the bus window and thought, very carefully, about what she was doing and what it could cost her. The following week passed in the ordinary way. Marco's school runs in meridian shifts and the slow arithmetic of managing money that was not enough for what it needed to cover. She visited her mother at the care facility on Wednesday afternoon, sitting beside her bed while her mother slept through most of the visit and woke briefly to ask whether Cara had eaten, which was the thing she always asked. Cara said yes, which was mostly true. She was running the numbers in her mind, not obsessively but steadily, the way she ran all calculations. What she'd found was real. What it contained was not yet proven. What she could do about it without exposing herself to legal risk or institutional pressure or simply being wrong was not clear. She spent 3 evenings that week on the phone. The first call was to the state's Underground Transit Authority Historical Preservation Office, which turned out to be a single coordinator named Meredith who worked part-time and was clearly surprised to receive a call with a specific research question. Cara described the station carefully, without mentioning the sealed entrance or the train, framing her question as a historical interest in the Harmon Street Auxiliary Facility. Meredith was helpful and somewhat excited. "No one ever asks about the Harmon Street facility," she said. "It's been off the records so long most people don't know it existed." Off the records. Cara wrote that down. Meredith told her that the facility appeared in some early planning documents but had been administratively removed from the Transit Authority's active inventory in 1944 as part of a wartime consolidation. She said there had been some inquiry from a private researcher about 10 years ago, which had generated a brief internal review, but nothing had come of it. The station was classified as decommissioned inactive, same category as the rest of the lower network. Cara asked whether the Transit Authority had any record of what the station had been used for between its construction in 1943 and its decommissioning in 1944. There was a pause. Meredith said she'd have to look into that. She asked for Cara's contact information. Cara gave her work email address, the Meridian one, and thanked her. She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand. 10 years ago, a private researcher had made inquiries. A brief internal review had followed. Nothing had come of it. She added that to her list and circled it. The second call was to a historian at the city's public library who specialized in wartime urban history. He was harder to reach and less forthcoming when she got through, giving her the careful, non-committal answers of someone who'd been burned before by sharing information used in ways he hadn't intended. He confirmed the general existence of federal transit use programs during the war, confirmed that gold reserve transfers had occurred in several major cities, and said anything more specific would require archival access that was not publicly available. Then he asked her why she was asking. She said she was writing a piece about the city's transit history. He said good luck with that in a tone that suggested he did not think luck was the relevant variable, and ended the call. The third call was to a real estate attorney. The kind of consultation you could get for free in the first 20 minutes if you found the right firm. She did not tell the attorney about the station. She asked, hypothetically, about the legal framework for fines made on or beneath public property. The attorney's answer was measured. Generally, assets found on public property were the property of the relevant government entity, but wartime programs occasionally created unusual jurisdictional questions, particularly regarding materials transferred between agencies and not clearly accounted for in surviving records. The word abandoned was key. If assets had been legally abandoned, which was a specific legal status, the framework shifted. She recommended anyone in such a situation seek proper legal counsel before taking any action. Cara thanked her and hung up. Legal abandonment. She wrote that down too. She thought about October 1944, a station sealed in November of the same year. A manifest that should have been attached to a transfer confirmation and was not. Program records administratively removed from accessible archives. The Transit Authority's response to her inspection report characterized as closed. If something had been placed in that station in October 1944 and the relevant program records had been removed from accessible archives and the manifest had been separated from its confirmation, then what had been placed there was either still there, legally abandoned for almost 80 years, or it had been removed at some point under circumstances that had also not been officially recorded. She thought about the welded banding on the cargo doors. She thought about what it would mean to be wrong. She thought about Marco's school fees and her mother's care costs and the $47 and the eviction notice. Then she made her decision. The next practical problem was the cargo car doors. The padlocks were the same barrel design as the entrance lock, and she was reasonably confident she could work them the same way. The welded banding was more complicated. Someone had run metal strapping through anchor points on the door frame and then seam welded the strapping in place. There was no mechanical release. Accessing the cargo space without cutting equipment she didn't have would not work through the doors. She thought about this for 2 days before realizing she was approaching the problem from the wrong direction. She'd been thinking about the doors. She should have been thinking about the car itself. A wooden slatted cargo car from the 1940s was built with wood over a metal frame. The slats were not load-bearing in the structural sense. The car did not depend on them for integrity. If a slat were removed, the car would not collapse. The slats were fixed with bolts through the metal frame. Old bolts, rusted, but accessible. She had a wrench. She had time. This was the thought she went to sleep with on a Thursday night. The specific, practical thought of a woman who'd spent 3 years learning to fix things that other people found difficult, who'd developed, in borrowed boots and long tunnels, a particular kind of patience for problems that needed solving carefully rather than quickly. Friday morning she packed her kit. Saturday, she called Mrs. Vega to ask if Marco could spend the afternoon at her apartment. Mrs. Vega said of course. She'd been meaning to bake something, and Marco could help. Marco was pleased about this in the contained, unsurprised way of a child who'd learned to accept goodness when it arrived. Cara went to the tunnel. Gerald was not at his desk on Saturday. A different man was there, younger, reading something on a tablet. He logged her entry the same way, checked her credentials, handed her the key. She went in. She moved through the corridor at her usual pace, reached the bricked section, worked the lock, stepped through. The sealed door swung inward. The cool air came out to meet her. The tiles caught her headlamp and gave the light back clean. She went down the steps to the platform, crossed to the north end, and stood at the edge looking at the first cargo car. Up close, in the focused light of her headlamp, the car was in better condition than she'd expected. The wood was dry. The metal frame showed surface rust, but no structural compromise. The bolt heads visible along the lower edge of the slatted wall were recessed in square mounting plates, consistent and uniform. She set her bag down on the platform and took out the wrench. She worked the first bolt slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood that speed and carelessness in the wrong sequence could strip a thread or crack a slat and leave her with something broken that could not be fixed. The bolt turned. The second bolt turned. By the time she'd removed a section of 3 slats from the lower third of the car wall, creating a gap roughly 18 inches high and 30 inches wide, she had been working for the better part of an hour. Her hands ached from the torque. Her knees hurt from crouching on the concrete edge of the platform. She was breathing harder than the physical exertion fully explained. She shone her headlamp through the gap. For a long moment, for the length of several slow breaths, she did not move. The interior of the car was stacked floor to ceiling with wooden crates. Each crate was approximately 12 inches square and 18 inches long, and they were stacked in a pattern that suggested they'd been loaded by someone who knew how weight needed to be distributed for transit. Every crate was sealed with a lid that had been screwed down and then banded with the same metal strapping used on the doors. The top surface of every crate she could see bore a stenciled marking, a letter number code she did not recognize, followed by a symbol that might have been a scale, and below that, in stenciled block letters, the same 3 words repeated on every visible surface. Treasury Department restricted. She counted the rows she could see. 9 across, 4 high. She could not see the depth of the stacking, but the crate dimensions and the car's interior length, which she'd estimated at 30 feet, suggested the stacking went back at least 20 rows. 9 by 4 by 20. 720 crates in the first car alone. And behind it, another car exactly the same size with the same sealed doors and the same welded banding. She pulled a crate toward her through the gap. It was heavier than she expected. Much heavier. She got it to the platform edge before the weight made her stop, breathing hard, the muscles in her forearms burning from the grip. She set it on the platform and sat back. She'd moved crates of similar volume before, loading hardware onto flatbeds for Meridian jobs. A crate that size, if it held tools or packaged goods, would weigh 20 to 30 pounds. This one had her breathing hard after a few feet of sliding and required both hands and most of her upper body strength to position at the platform edge. It weighed more than 60 pounds, possibly more than 70. She looked at the crate dimensions. She thought about what was dense enough to account for that weight in a space that size. She thought about the standard specifications of a federal gold bar. 27 pounds per bar. A 12 by 18-inch crate, stacked efficiently, could hold 2 bars. Maybe 3, if the internal packing was minimal and the bars were oriented lengthwise. 2 to 3 bars per crate. 720 crates per car. 2 cars. At current market value, a single standard gold bar was worth approximately $700,000. She stopped calculating because the number her phone's calculator returned when she ran it to its end was not a number she could hold in her mind as real while sitting on the concrete platform of an underground station with borrowed boots and a 30-day eviction extension. $420 million. Give or take, depending on the actual count and the grade of the bars. She put the crate back. She worked the slats back into position and re-bolted them, careful about thread engagement, leaving no visible evidence of disturbance. She took photographs through the gap before closing it, enough to document what she'd seen without removing anything. Then she sat on one of the old wooden benches on the platform and thought for a long time. What she'd found was real. The physical evidence was clear. The historical documentation she'd assembled formed a coherent line from the wartime program to this station to these cars. The weight of the crate she'd moved was not the weight of empty wood or stored paperwork. What she was less certain about was what came next. She understood enough about how situations like this could unfold to know that going public, going to the press, or to a higher authority with what she'd found, was not automatically a safe choice. Phil's email had told her something. The transit authority's response had told her something. Meredith's mention of a prior private researcher a decade ago had told her something. There were people who knew this station existed, or suspected it. The fact that it was still sealed after almost 80 years meant that whoever knew had chosen, repeatedly, to leave it sealed. The prior researcher. 10 years ago. A brief internal review. Nothing had come of it. What had happened to that researcher? She needed to find out. She turned off her headlamp and sat in the complete dark of the sealed station for a moment. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a place that had been waiting a long time. She felt it around her, still and steady, like company. Then she turned her light back on, stood, gathered her bag, and went back through the platform and up the steps and through the tiled corridor and through the brick door into the main tunnel. She sealed the lock. She walked the route back to the entrance. The substitute was still at the desk. He logged her out without looking up. She walked to the bus stop in the afternoon light, her bag over her shoulder, her borrowed boots on her feet, her phone in her pocket with the photographs she'd taken, and the quiet, certain knowledge of what she'd found sitting inside her chest like something that had finally stopped moving after a very long fall. She had 30 days before the eviction proceedings started. She had a sealed station and a train and 2 cars and something that weighed 60+ pounds per crate, stacked in rows across a cargo hold that went back as far as her headlamp could see. She had the patience her grandmother had described as almost frightening. The bus home was crowded with Saturday afternoon noise, families in groups, and the easy sound of people with nowhere urgent to be. She stood near the door with her bag between her feet and her hand on the overhead rail, looking out the window as the city moved past. The buildings above the old commercial district were unchanged. Brick and glass and steel, people moving through them, cars filling the streets, everyone's ordinary Saturday spreading out in every direction from this window. 200 feet below a section of that street, a train was sitting in the dark on a track that did not officially exist, and it had been sitting there since before most of the people on this bus were born. She thought about all the people who had walked above it over those decades. The city workers who managed the surrounding infrastructure. The construction crews who poured the foundations of newer buildings nearby. The transit authority staff who processed the decommissioned inactive classification year after year without going down to look. 80 years of people going about their lives directly above a sealed station that held something the federal government had once considered important enough to hide. She got off at her stop and walked the 4 blocks to the apartment. Mrs. Vega's door was open when she passed it, the smell of something baking coming through. She could hear Marco's voice inside, telling a story about something that happened at school, his words coming fast and confident the way they did when he was comfortable. She paused in the hallway and listened for a moment without going in. His voice was the clearest sound in the world to her. She carried it the way she carried the eviction notice, but differently. The notice was weight. His voice was direction. She knocked on Mrs. Vega's door. Marco came to it and looked up at her with flour on his cheek and the satisfied expression of a child who'd been useful and knew it. "We made empanadas," he said. "I can smell them," she said. He studied her face the way children did when they were checking whether something was wrong. She kept her expression easy. "Can I stay for dinner?" he asked. 1 hour, she said. "I'll come back." He disappeared back into Mrs. Vega's kitchen. She went into her own apartment, locked the door, and sat at the kitchen table. She opened her laptop and pulled up the legal pad with her notes. She read through everything from the beginning. The inspection, the wall, the lock, the station, the train, the crates, the weight of the crate she'd moved. She wrote at the bottom of the page, in the same handwriting she'd used for everything else, calm and factual. What happens to a person who finds something like this? She stared at the question for a moment. Then she wrote below it, find the researcher, find the manifest, find the legal path. She was not going to look away from what she'd found. She was not going to sell the information or the access or the silence. She was going to find out exactly what was in those cars, exactly what legal framework applied to what she'd found, and exactly who had made the decisions that left a federal cache sealed in a forgotten station for 80 years while the city moved overhead. and then she was going to figure out what to do with all of it. Her grandmother had said her work ethic was almost frightening. She was just getting started. She found the name on a Monday morning, 6 days after the Saturday she'd first seen the inside of the cargo car. She'd spent the days between working her regular meridian shifts, picking up Marco from school, making dinners that stretched the grocery budget without making the stretching obvious, and sitting at the kitchen table after Marco was asleep running searches on her laptop until her eyes hurt. The focus had sharpened her in some way she hadn't expected. She'd been exhausted for months, the grinding kind that accumulates when there's no margin in a life. But now there was a different kind of alertness underneath the tiredness. The feeling of a person who has found a reason to be precise. The state archive system had a public request portal for historical records related to government facilities. She'd filed a request the week before, framing it as research into wartime infrastructure use, and the response had come back with a list of prior requests on related topics. The system showed request history by subject matter going back 30 years, with requester names redacted to initials only. Most of the entries on the Harmon Street file were administrative, the Transit Authority's own periodic reviews, 2 requests from what looked like academic sources, and then, 10 years ago, 3 separate requests filed in a 6-month span by a requester identified as EM. She cross-referenced the date range with the university library database, searching for publications about wartime transit infrastructure from around the same period. On the 3rd search variation she tried, she found a footnote in an academic paper about urban logistics history, a paper by a Dr. Ellen Marsh, associate professor of urban history at the city's state university, that referenced the Harmon Street Auxiliary as a site of wartime federal use, pending further archival investigation. Published 9 years ago. She searched for Dr. Ellen Marsh's subsequent publications. There were none. The university's faculty directory showed her as an associate professor with a note that she was currently on extended personal leave. Her university profile page had not been updated in 8 years. Cara sat with this for a long moment. A historian who'd been actively researching the Harmon Street Station had stopped publishing, stopped updating her professional profile, and gone on extended personal leave shortly after filing 3 archival requests about the facility. That was the shape of something. She could not say yet what shape exactly, but it was not the shape of coincidence. She sent an email to the university's history department, identifying herself as a researcher with an interest in wartime transit infrastructure and asking whether Dr. Marsh was available for consultation. The response came back within a day from a departmental administrator, polite and brief. Dr. Marsh was currently unavailable for professional correspondence. If she had questions related to urban history research, she was welcome to contact any of the department's other faculty members. She wrote the response down on her legal pad, word for word, and added it to the page where she'd already written "Find the researcher." Find the manifest. Find the legal path. Then she started thinking about the manifest. The transfer confirmation she'd found in the city records office referenced it directly. The manifest should have accompanied the confirmation as its attached document. The fact that it was missing from the file she'd found was not an accident. The carbon paper the confirmation was typed on, the care of its language, the countersignatures, these were the marks of official documentation maintained with intention. You did not lose the manifest of a document like that through administrative carelessness. You removed it deliberately, which meant it existed somewhere else. Where government documents went when they were removed from general files was not a random question. It had a specific answer. They were either destroyed, which left a destruction record in most archival systems, or they were reclassified and moved to restricted access storage, which left a transfer record. She needed to find one or the other. She spent 2 evenings working through the National Archives online finding aids for the relevant agencies. The Treasury Department's wartime records were voluminous and complex, organized by program and by year, but the finding aids were public and searchable. Program Directive 18G appeared in the index as a program classification from the wartime economic stabilization period, cross-referenced to a series of boxes held in restricted access. The series description was brief: Wartime Strategic Materials Transfer Documentation, Consolidated 1944 to 1947, access by written request to the National Archives Regional Office. Written request. She'd never made a formal request to the National Archives before. She understood that the process took time, weeks at minimum, sometimes months. She had 30 days on her eviction extension, and that clock was not stopping. She filed the request anyway, filling in the online form with careful language, identifying herself as an independent researcher and citing the public interest nature of historical documentation regarding wartime federal programs. Then she called the regional office number listed on the website to follow up and spoke with a records specialist who was genuinely helpful in the way that people in large bureaucracies sometimes were when they liked what they did. He told her the standard processing time was 4 to 8 weeks. He told her she could request expedited review for research of documented historical significance, which required a supporting letter from an academic institution or recognized historical organization. He also told her, almost as an aside, that several of the boxes in the 18G series had themselves been reclassified at some point in the past and were currently under a secondary access restriction that would require additional clearance beyond the standard research protocol. She thanked him and hung up and sat looking at the ceiling. The boxes had been reclassified. Sometime after initial classification, someone had added a secondary restriction to the very files most likely to contain the manifest she was looking for. That was a decision made by a person or an office at a specific point in time. It was not a default setting. Someone had chosen to make those particular records harder to reach. She thought about the private researcher from 10 years ago. She thought about the brief internal review that had followed and produced nothing. She thought about Ellen Marsh on extended personal leave with no publications since. She was starting to understand the shape of it now. Not all of it, not the full picture, but the outline of a thing that had been managed for a long time by people who knew exactly what they were protecting and had the institutional reach to protect it effectively. They had not needed to be aggressive about it. They had simply made the records difficult and the pathway slow and the researchers uncertain of what they were really dealing with. That was usually enough. She was not going to let it be enough. The transit authority employee she found was not someone she'd looked for. He found her, in a manner of speaking, through the particular small city mechanism of mutual acquaintance. A woman at the Meridian Depot who knew Cara was doing the tunnel inspection had mentioned it in passing to her husband, who worked part-time for a transit authority maintenance crew, who mentioned it to a man named Vernon Spade. Vernon called the Meridian office and left a message asking if the inspector working the lower tunnel network could call him back. The dispatcher passed it along to Cara with mild curiosity and no particular recommendation either way. She called the number. Vernon was 73 years old, his voice carrying the measured weight of someone who'd spent a career listening to machinery and had developed the habit of speaking with the same kind of patience. He'd worked for the Transit Authority for 31 years as a maintenance engineer. He'd retired 11 years ago. He told her this in the first minute of their conversation, not as preamble, but as context. He wanted her to understand who she was talking to before he said what he'd called to say. He said he'd heard she was doing an inspection of the Lower South Network. He said he wanted to talk to her about something he'd seen once, a long time ago, that he'd never told anyone because he hadn't known what to do with it. He said he was telling her now because he was 73 and the thing had weighed on him, and it was past time to say it out loud. She met him that Thursday evening at a diner near the Transit Authority maintenance yard, a place he'd chosen because he knew the staff and trusted the coffee. He was a tall man, thin by age, but still carrying the posture of someone who'd spent decades on his feet. He sat across from her in a corner booth and looked at her for a moment before he started talking, sizing her up the way she'd come to recognize in people who'd kept something to themselves for a long time and were trying to decide if the person in front of them could be trusted with it. He'd been a young engineer, 26 years old, doing routine maintenance in the lower network when he found it, he told her. Not the station, not the train. He'd found the door. He'd noticed the bricked section the same way Cara had, by measuring his position against the map and finding that the distance did not add up. He'd photographed it and written it into his inspection report, and his supervisor at the time, a man named Gorman who'd been with the authority 20 years already, had taken the report from him privately and told him to forget about it. Not harshly, not with any kind of threat. Gorman had simply put the report in his own drawer, closed the drawer, and told Vernon that some parts of the lower network had complicated histories that were better left alone, and that the authority appreciated Vernon's thoroughness and expected he'd continue to focus his attention on the designated work areas. Vernon had been 26 and new, and Gorman had been his supervisor. He'd done what Gorman said. He'd thought about it over the years, he told Cara. Not constantly, but it would surface sometimes. The kind of thing that sits in the back of a mind and resurfaces without invitation. When he retired, he'd gone back through his own records from that period, looking for the original inspection notes. They weren't there. The relevant job records from that section of his maintenance history had been removed from his files at some point. He didn't know when. He told her all of this in a steady voice with his hands flat on the table and his coffee untouched in front of him. When he finished, he looked at her and asked what she'd found when she went in. She looked at him for a moment. Then she told him about the station, about the platform and the benches and the service booth with the coat on the hook, about the train and the 2 cargo cars and the stenciled crates and the weight of the one she'd moved. She did not tell him the number she'd calculated. She was not ready to say that number out loud to anyone yet. Vernon listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He said, "I figured it was something like that." She asked what he meant. He said that Gorman, his old supervisor, had died 4 years ago. And at the funeral, someone who'd worked with Gorman for 20 years had told a story about how Gorman used to say, late in his career, that he'd done 2 things in his time at the Transit Authority he wasn't proud of. One of them, the man had said, was taking something from a young engineer that the young engineer should have been allowed to pursue. He'd never explained what he meant. Vernon had been at the funeral and had heard the story and had understood immediately what Gorman was referring to. Cara sat across from Vernon in the corner booth of the diner and thought about a man named Gorman who'd spent his career knowing what was behind the brick wall and choosing silence, and who described it, at the end of his life, as something he was not proud of. She thanked Vernon. She asked him if he'd be willing to put what he'd told her in writing, a signed statement, if it came to that. He said yes. He said he should have done it a long time ago. She walked home from the diner in the cold, her hands in her pockets, thinking about chains of people who'd known and chosen not to speak. Gorman and the young Vernon. Ellen Marsh on extended personal leave. The Transit Authority's polite, closed item. And somewhere behind all of it, a set of decisions made in November 1944 that had started the whole chain going. She needed the legal path. She'd been putting off the attorney conversation because she could not afford a proper consultation and she was still assembling the full picture. But she understood now that the full picture was not going to arrive in a tidy package. She was going to have to act before she had everything, and she needed to understand her legal position before she acted. She called the same real estate attorney she'd spoken to before, the one who'd mentioned legal abandonment, and this time she was more direct. She said she had reason to believe she'd located federal assets from a wartime program that had been sealed in 1944 and were not recorded in any accessible current inventory. She asked what that meant legally. The attorney listened without interrupting and then said she was going to be honest. The legal framework for this situation was genuinely complex, and she was not the right person to navigate it. What Cara needed was someone with experience in government property law, specifically the Abandoned Shipwreck Act's analogous federal property statutes and the legal doctrine of government abandonment as it applied to tangible assets. She gave Cara the name of a colleague who specialized in exactly that. The colleague was a man named Marcus Breen. He had an office on the 14th floor of a building downtown and wore the kind of suits that said he was good at what he did. He agreed to an initial consultation at no charge after Cara gave him a brief summary over the phone, which told her that the brief summary had sounded interesting enough to be worth his time. She sat across from him the following Tuesday afternoon with her legal pad and her photograph files on her phone and her folder of document copies and told him what she'd found, all of it, in the order she'd found it. He listened with the specific quality of attention that people developed when they were professionally obligated to hear things without reacting to them. He took notes. When she finished, he asked several questions, precise and technical, about the nature of the documentation she'd found, the current classification status of the related federal records, the Transit Authority's response to her inspection report, and the location and condition of the assets themselves. Then he told her several things she needed to know. The doctrine of government abandonment, he said, required proving 3 elements: that the government had held the assets, that it had relinquished control, and that it had no ongoing claim. The first element was well supported by the documentation she'd assembled, including the transfer confirmation and the appropriations ledger reference. The second was more complex. Sealing a facility was not the same as relinquishing control. The government could argue it had merely secured the assets for later retrieval. But, he said, and this was where his voice shifted slightly, 80 years was an unusual amount of time for a retrieval that had not happened. And the removal of program records from accessible archives, combined with the administrative erasure of the station from transit authority records, created an interesting evidentiary picture. It suggested that the decision to leave the assets in place had been a conscious choice, repeated at multiple administrative intervals, rather than a simple oversight. And a government entity that repeatedly chose not to retrieve assets it knew about and repeatedly chose to obscure documentation of those assets was building a case for effective abandonment whether it intended to or not. He also told her something else. The fact that she'd entered the station and photographed the contents, while legally gray, was not straightforwardly illegal given her status as a licensed infrastructure inspector operating in a tunnel system she'd been authorized to enter. The fact that she'd opened the cargo car wall was more complicated. He advised her strongly not to return to the station or touch anything further before they'd established a clear legal strategy. She told him she understood. He said he needed 2 weeks to research the specific legal framework and file a preliminary inquiry with the relevant federal agencies. He quoted her a fee for initial representation that was more money than she had available. She told him that plainly. He looked at her for a moment, then said he'd take the case on a contingency basis against any eventual settlement or recovery, which meant she owed him nothing unless, and until the case produced a result. She understood that this meant he believed in the case. She walked out of Marcus Breen's office on the 14th floor and stood waiting for the elevator with her legal pad under her arm and her folder of documents in her hand, looking at the city through the lobby windows, and felt the structure of what she was doing shift into something more solid. She was not alone in this anymore. She had Vernon's testimony and Marcus's legal framework and the documentation she'd assembled, and she had the station itself, sealed and intact and waiting. She also had, she discovered the following morning, the attention of someone she hadn't been prepared for. The call came through the Meridian office line, not her personal number. The caller identified himself as Deputy Director Hollis from the Transit Authority's Infrastructure Management Division, and his tone was the particular brand of bureaucratic warmth that covered something less warm underneath. He said he was calling to follow up on the inspection report she'd filed for the Lower South Network, specifically the West Corridor Wall notation that had been marked closed. He said the Transit Authority wanted to make sure all items were fully resolved from the inspector's perspective before they closed out the project entirely. She listened to this and said that yes, from her perspective as the inspector, the notation had been adequately documented and she had no outstanding items in the Meridian reporting system. Hollis said that was good to hear. He said the Transit Authority valued the thoroughness of Meridian's work and hoped to continue the relationship. He asked, in a tone that implied casualness without quite achieving it, whether she'd had occasion to revisit the West Corridor after filing her original report. She said she'd completed a standard follow-up verification within the permitted 48-hour window, as logged in the entry record. He said of course, and thanked her for her time. She put the phone down and sat at her kitchen table looking at nothing in particular. The call had told her several things. First, the Transit Authority was monitoring the entry logs for the lower network. Second, someone in that organization had enough interest in the West Corridor to personally call the inspector who'd flagged it, rather than leaving the matter to Phil and the standard Meridian correspondence chain. Third, Hollis had chosen to call through the Meridian office rather than reaching out to her directly, which meant either he didn't have her personal contact or he'd wanted the conversation to appear routine. She called Marcus Breen's office and left a message describing the call in detail. He called back within the hour and said this was not unexpected but was good to know about. He said she should log the call and continue documenting everything with dates and specifics. He said not to volunteer any information and not to return to the site under any circumstances while the legal framework was being established. She said she understood, again. She picked Marco up from school that afternoon, and on the walk home he told her about a project he was working on for science class, something about the layers of the earth, how you could dig down through soil and clay and rock and find different things at different depths, how the deeper you went the older the material. She listened to him explain it with the serious enthusiasm he brought to subjects that caught his interest, and thought about sealed stations 200 feet underground and 80 years of city above them. That's interesting, she said. What's at the very bottom? He thought about it. The core, he said. It's mostly iron. Really hot iron. She looked at him walking beside her with his backpack and his muddy sneakers and the flour that was probably still in the seam of his ear from Mrs. Vega's empanadas 2 Saturdays ago, and felt the full weight of what she was doing settle on her with a clarity that was almost physical. This was what it was for. Not abstractly. Specifically. For him. For the glow stars going dark on his ceiling and the borrowed boots, and the 30-day extension on an eviction notice and the cost of a care facility that was keeping her mother alive. She was not going to look away. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The man who appeared at her apartment building 3 days later was not from the Transit Authority. He made that clear immediately, in the same breath as his introduction, as though he understood that clarity on this point would be the difference between her listening and her shutting the door. His name was Gerald Ashmore, he said, and he represented a private asset recovery firm called Consolidated Historical Recovery Partners, and he was there because his firm had become aware that she might have information of mutual interest. She did not open her door past the chain. She looked at him through the gap. He was in his mid-50s, the kind of carefully maintained mid-50s that involved regular exercise and expensive skincare, wearing a coat that cost more than her monthly rent. He held a business card at the Gap without pushing it through, patient and practiced. She asked him how he'd found her address. He said the firm had resources for that kind of research and left it at that. She asked what mutual interest he thought they might have. He said his firm specialized in the identification and legal recovery of historically significant lost assets. He said they were aware of certain research activity around a wartime federal facility in the city's lower transit network. He said the firm was in a position to provide substantial financial support for the legal process required to make a recovery claim of this nature, in exchange for an agreed percentage of the eventual recovery value. She listened to this and thought about Marcus Breen's contingency arrangement and the documentation she'd spent weeks building and Vernon Spade sitting in a diner booth with his untouched coffee. She asked what percentage. He said the firm typically worked on a 60-40 basis in situations where they provided both legal support and financing, 60 to the firm, 40 to the original finder. She looked at him for a long moment through the chain gap. She said she wasn't interested and closed the door. She heard him stand in the hallway for a moment. Then she heard him walk away. She stood with her back against the door and breathed slowly and thought about the fact that a private asset recovery firm had found her apartment and knocked on her door within 3 days of Hollis's call through the Meridian office. That sequence was not accidental. Someone in the Transit Authority's Infrastructure Management Division had shared information with a private firm. She could not prove that yet, but she could think about it clearly, and thinking about it clearly told her that the people who knew about Harmon Street were not all on the same side of what happened to it. She called Marcus Breen and told him about Ashmore. He said he'd make a note of it. He said it was not entirely surprising that private recovery interests had become aware of her inquiries, given the number of institutional channels she'd moved through. He said it confirmed that her legal filing needed to happen sooner rather than later to establish her position of record before other parties could create competing claims. He said he was accelerating his timeline. She went to the kitchen table and updated her notes. Everything in order, everything dated. She'd been doing this from the beginning, but she added a new page now specifically for the events of the past week. The Hollis call. Ashmore at the door. The 60-40 offer that assumed she was operating without a legal framework and might be persuaded by the number alone. She thought about Ellen Marsh. She was not going to become the next Ellen Marsh. She had been trying to reach the historian through channels that went through the university and its administrator gatekeeping, and she'd been getting nowhere. She spent a Sunday afternoon trying a different approach, searching for any public record of Marsh's current location. The faculty page gave her nothing current. Published works gave her the same last publication from 9 years ago. But a city property record search turned up a listing for an L&M Marsh at an address 15 minutes from the university, a purchase from 7 years ago, no subsequent sales. She drove past it that Sunday, not planning to knock, just orienting herself. It was a small house on a quiet street, the garden slightly overgrown in the specific way of someone who'd once cared about it and no longer quite had the energy. The curtains were closed across the front window, but there was a car in the driveway. She went back on a Tuesday evening after dropping Marco at Mrs. Vegas. She knocked. The woman who answered the door was in her late 40s, with the particular quality of someone who'd been through something and come out the other side, carrying it visibly. Her eyes were careful. She looked at Cara with an immediate recognition that surprised Cara, a recognition that turned quickly to something close to alarm. "You're the inspector," Marsh said. "From the tunnel." Cara stared at her. She had not told the history department she was an inspector. She'd said she was a researcher. Marsh said, "Hollis called me 3 days ago. He mentioned a Meridian inspector was asking questions about Harmon Street. He wanted to know if I'd had any contact with you." Cara felt the air in the doorway shift. She said, "What did you tell him?" Marsh said, "I told him I hadn't." She paused. That was the truth at the time. She looked at Cara for another moment. Then she opened the door wider and stepped back. "You'd better come in." The house was exactly what Cara had expected from the garden. Books stacked on surfaces that were not quite shelves, a desk in the corner of the living room that still held research materials even though the research had apparently stopped. Marsh made tea without asking whether Cara wanted any and brought 2 cups to the low table between them and sat down. She'd been a tenure-track historian 9 years ago, she said. Her specialty was wartime urban infrastructure. She'd been working on what she expected to be her most significant publication, a full account of the federal transit use program, when she'd filed archival requests on Harmon Street and received, instead of documents, a visit from 2 men who did not give her their real names. They'd been polite. They'd been clear. They'd told her that the material she was requesting was under an ongoing federal security classification that was not subject to standard academic access requests, and that pursuing her research into that specific facility would constitute an unauthorized investigation into restricted government operations under a statute she'd never heard of. She'd consulted a lawyer who'd confirmed the statute existed and that the men's position, while aggressive, was not entirely without legal basis in the specific context of assets covered under wartime national security classifications that had never been formally lifted. Her lawyer had told her that fighting it would cost more than she had and might end her academic career if the university felt the legal exposure was too great. She'd stopped. She hadn't published. She'd taken personal leave. She'd eventually decided that the career she'd built was not worth the fight, but she'd also been unable to go back to it knowing what she knew and knowing she'd walked away. So she was here. 7 years in a house with overgrown gardens and research files she hadn't opened since the men in suits came to her office. Cara sat across from her and listened to all of this and thought about the farmer who'd stood in a field above an iron hatch, feeling the weight of a secret that had been placed on his land without his knowledge or consent, who'd recognized that ignoring it was not protection but participation. She told Marsh about the lock, about the station, about the crates, and what she'd found when she pulled one toward her and felt the weight. She told her about Marcus Breen and Vernon Spade and the documentation she'd assembled. She told her about Ashmore at the door with his 60-40 offer. Marsh listened with her tea untouched and her hands folded in her lap and her careful eyes very still. When Cara finished, Marsh said, "Do you know who signed the Program Directive 18G closure authorization?" Cara said she'd seen the transfer confirmation, but the signatures were identified by agency designation rather than name. Marsh reached across the room to the desk in the corner and pulled a folder from near the bottom of a stack, the movement of someone who knows exactly where something is even after 7 years of not opening it. She set it on the table between them. Inside was a printed copy of a document Cara hadn't seen before, a different page of the same 18G program file, obtained through a separate archival channel before the access had been restricted. At the bottom of the document, in the signature block, were 2 names. One was an agency official she didn't recognize. The other was the name of a man who had later become a United States Senator, who had served on the Senate's Finance and Banking subcommittees for 22 years, and whose family foundation remained one of the most politically connected private organizations in the state. Cara looked at the name for a long time. She understood now why the access had been restricted. She understood why Ellen Marsh had been visited by men in suits. She understood why the prior internal review had produced nothing and why the Transit Authority's response to her inspection report had moved directly to closed without explanation. The man who'd signed the 1944 closure authorization had spent 2 decades on the committees that oversaw the very agencies most likely to investigate what he'd signed. And his family foundation, by implication, had spent the subsequent decades with a vested interest in keeping the questions about what had been signed unasked. She thought about the total value of the gold she'd estimated. $420 million. She thought about who would benefit from that number remaining inaccessible in a sealed station under a city street. She also thought about the doctrine of government abandonment that Marcus Breen had described, and about the fact that 80 years of deliberate obscuring of documentation was not the same as a legitimate ongoing claim. She said, "Will you give me a copy of this document?" Marsh looked at her. Then she went back to the desk and made a copy on a small printer that looked like it hadn't been used in some time. She handed Cara the copy and sat back down. She said, "I stopped because I thought the cost was too high." She looked at her hands. "I still don't know if I was wrong, but I've thought about it every day since." She looked up at Cara. "What are you going to do?" Cara said, "I'm going to do what should have been done when you found it. I'm going to make the case through every available legitimate channel simultaneously, quickly enough that the people who've been managing the silence can't respond to one front before another one opens." Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're going to need the logbook." Cara said she knew. She'd seen it through the locomotive cab glass. She hadn't been back in since Marcus told her not to return. Marsh said that the logbook was the key to everything. The program's transfer documentation, the manifest most likely, would have traveled with the supervising transit authority liaison. The liaison would have logged the handover in the station logbook as standard operating procedure. If the logbook was intact, it would contain the manifest details, the bar counts, the serial numbers, possibly the authorization chain going all the way to the agency that had directed the transfer. It would be the single most complete piece of evidence available for proving what was in those cars, and who had put it there, and under whose authority. Cara thought about what it would mean to go back into the station against Marcus's explicit advice. She thought about what it would mean not to go back. She thought about 60-40. She thought about men in suits visiting a historian in her office. She thought about a Senate career built in the shadow of something sealed in 1944. She went home that night and sat with Marco while he finished his science homework, the one about the layers of the Earth. He showed her a diagram he'd drawn of the core and the mantle and the crust, the different colors he'd used to distinguish the layers, the careful labels in his still slightly uneven handwriting. She said, "You did a good job." He said, "Did you know the iron in the core is the same iron that's in our blood? The teacher told us that. Because everything on Earth came from the same place originally." She looked at his diagram and said she hadn't known that. He said, "So when you go really deep underground, you're finding where everything came from." She put her arm around his shoulders and held him there for a moment. Her son with his muddy sneakers and his glow stars and his diagram of the layers of the Earth. She was going to go back to the station. But she was going to do it correctly this time, documented and witnessed, and protected in every way she could manage before she went through that brick door again. She was not going to hand anyone a reason to make this about her conduct instead of about what was inside those cars. She called Marcus the next morning and told him what she'd learned from Ellen Marsh. She told him about the signature on the 18G closure authorization and what she knew about the man's subsequent political career. She told him about Ashmore and the 60-40 offer. She told him about Hollis calling Marsh within 3 days of calling her. She told him everything in the order she had it, the same way she'd told him about the station. He was quiet for a moment when she finished. Then he said, "We need to file immediately. Not the preliminary inquiry. The actual claim. Today." She asked if he was ready. He said he'd been ready since their first meeting. He'd been waiting to see whether she was going to keep going or if she was going to take the private firm's offer. He said the scope of what she'd described, the signature on that authorization, the political dimensions, this was not a local transit authority matter. This was going to involve federal agencies at the highest level, and she needed to understand that clearly before they proceeded. She said she understood. He said, "Are you sure? Because once we file, you're in this. All the way through. These are not people who will simply accept the filing and cooperate gracefully." She thought about Marco's iron core, where everything came from. She thought about the $47 and the borrowed boots and the eviction notice that was going to expire in 11 days. She thought about her mother in the care facility asking whether she'd eaten. She said she was sure. Marcus said he'd have the filing ready by end of day. She went to work that morning. A routine meridian shift in a different part of the city, a ventilation assessment in a utility corridor under the financial district. She went through the motions of the work with the same precision she always brought to it, photographing walls and measuring clearances and noting her findings on the clipboard form. The tunnels were ordinary, loud with the mechanical hum of active systems. Nothing unusual, nothing sealed or hidden. She finished her inspection and went up to street level and stood in the cold outside the utility access point, her breath visible in the air, the city noise closing back around her after the relative quiet of the tunnel. She thought about what was coming. She was under no illusions. Marcus had been clear, and she was not a person who softened difficult realities for herself. The filing would create a legal record of her claim. It would trigger responses from multiple agencies. It would likely intensify the attention already being directed at her from the transit authority side. There would be pressure. The kind of pressure that had sent Ellen Marsh to a house with overgrown gardens and 9 years of silence. But the pressure assumed she could be worn down, isolated, made to feel that the cost of continuing was greater than the value of the thing she was pursuing. That assumption required a particular kind of person, someone who could be outweighed. She was thinking about this, standing on the street in the cold, when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. No name, no identification. Just 7 words. You should know you're being watched. Stop. She stood looking at the screen. Then she took a screenshot, texted it to Marcus's office number with a time-stamp note, and put her phone in her pocket. She walked to the bus stop and waited for the bus. She did not look around. She did not scan the street for vehicles or people watching from doorways. She had learned from the inspection work that watching for the thing you were afraid of was not the same as being prepared for it. And that preparation came from documentation and legal position and the slow, steady accumulation of facts, not from looking over your shoulder. She had the documentation. She had the legal position. She had Marcus filing the claim by end of day. She had Vernon's signed statement. She had Ellen Marsh's document with the name on the 18G authorization. She had the station, sealed and intact, and waiting 200 feet below the ordinary city. She had 11 days left on the eviction extension. The bus came and she got on it, borrowing boots on her feet, and rode it home to make dinner for her son. The legal filing landed in the federal system at 4:47 that afternoon. Marcus called her at 5 to confirm it. He said the filing had gone simultaneously to the Treasury Department's legal office, the National Archives Regulatory Division, the Transit Authority's legal department, and the Office of the City's Public Advocate, with courtesy copies to 2 journalists who specialized in historical accountability reporting and whom Marcus had cultivated professional relationships with over 15 years of this kind of work. He said this multi-front approach was the specific strategy she needed, because the people who'd managed the silence for 80 years had done so by controlling information flow. You disrupted that control not by being loud, but by making the information available to enough independent parties simultaneously that no single institutional actor could contain it. She listened to him explain this and thought about how long she'd spent building toward this moment. Every step from the initial inspection to the legal pad, to Vernon's diner booth, to Ellen Marsh's overgrown garden to this phone call. Each one building on the one before it, patient and precise and connected by the same refusal to stop. She thanked him. He said, "Thank me when it's done. Get some sleep. Tomorrow it starts." She sat at the kitchen table after the call and looked at her legal pad. The pages were dense now, weeks of notes and dates and names and connections, the record of a discovery and what a person did when they chose not to look away from it. She turned to a clean page and wrote the date at the top. Below it she wrote, "Filed. Legal clock started. What happens next happens in the open." She thought about the station in the dark below the city, the tiled corridor, the Harmon Street signs, the code on the hook in the service booth, the locomotive sitting at the platform edge with its logbook on the shelf behind the glass, the 2 sealed cargo cars with their rows of stenciled crates, and the name of a federal department that no longer existed in exactly that form, but whose obligations did not dissolve with administrative reorganization. She thought about what was inside those crates, the specific, physical fact of it, the weight of one box in her hands, the resistance of it, the cold metal surface of the bar she'd felt through the wood of the lid when she'd pressed against the top of the crate, testing. She had not mentioned that detail to Marcus or to Vernon or to anyone. She'd filed it away as private knowledge, the kind of thing you kept close not from dishonesty, but from the understanding that some knowledge was yours alone until the moment arrived to share it. The moment was coming. Tomorrow it would start. The agencies would receive the filing and assign it to case managers, and the legal wheels would begin turning, slowly at first, and then with the gathering momentum of a thing that had been set in motion correctly and could not easily be stopped. She thought about $47. She thought about the borrowed boots. She thought about what it would mean, practically, for Marco, and for her mother, and for the eviction notice in her pocket, if what she'd found was what she believed it was, and if the legal claim succeeded. She did not let herself sit in that thought for long. She had learned not to count money that was not yet hers. That kind of thinking was how people made bad decisions under pressure, reaching for certainty that wasn't available and settling for less than they'd found because the waiting was hard. She closed the legal pad. She went and checked on Marco, who was already asleep, his arm over his head, the glow stars on his ceiling faint and faithful above him. She stood in the doorway for a moment and thought, I found it. Whatever comes next, I found it. Nobody else did. I did. Then she went to bed. And in the dark below the city, 200 feet below the streets and the traffic and the people moving through their ordinary lives, the station waited. Sealed and quiet. The train at the platform. The crates in the cars. The logbook on its shelf behind the locomotive glass. Its pages holding the full account of what had been placed in those cars on a cold October day in 1944 by men who decided that secrecy was safer than transparency and who had been right about that for 80 years. The first response came within 18 hours of the filing, not from the Treasury Department, not from the National Archives. It came from the Transit Authority's legal department, a formal cease and desist letter delivered to Marcus Breen's office by courier, asserting that any access to or documentation of Transit Authority infrastructure by Cara Morales or her representatives without explicit written authorization from the authority's deputy director constituted trespass under city code and would be prosecuted accordingly. Marcus called her that morning before she'd had coffee. He read her the key language from the letter and then told her not to worry about it. She said she wasn't worried. She asked what it meant strategically. He said it meant the Transit Authority had received the filing, understood what it implied, and had chosen to respond with speed rather than deliberation. Speed, in his experience, meant alarm. Alarm meant the filing had landed closer to something sensitive than they'd expected. He said a cease and desist was a territorial move, not a substantive legal argument. It told her where the perimeter was, which was useful information. He said he was filing a motion that morning requesting a federal court order for supervised access and inspection of the Harmon Street facility, citing her status as the original documenting inspector, the pending claim filed with Treasury and the National Archives, and the public interest in full accounting of wartime federal assets. He said the motion would be heard within the week. She asked what she should do in the meantime. He said, go to work. Pick up your son from school. Do not go anywhere near that tunnel. She went to work. She picked up Marco from school. She made dinner. She sat at the kitchen table at night and read everything she could find about federal asset recovery law and wartime program classifications and the procedural history of cases involving government abandonment claims, of which there were, it turned out, more than she'd expected. Most of them had settled quietly and without public documentation, which was itself a form of information. The journalist Marcus had copied on the filing reached out to her within 48 hours. Both of them. One worked for a national publication that covered financial accountability and government history. The other was a local investigative reporter who had been writing about city infrastructure for 12 years and whose work Cara recognized from articles she'd read on her lunch break during meridian shifts. She agreed to speak with both of them, on the record, with Marcus present on the call. She told them what she'd found. She told them how she'd found it. She described the station in enough detail that it was clear she'd been inside and was describing real memory rather than constructed speculation. She told them about Vernon Spade. She told them about Ellen Marsh. She told them about Hollis and Ashmore and the anonymous text. She did not, on Marcus's advice, tell them about the signature on the 18G authorization. That was a detail to release at the right moment, not to lead with. It was the kind of thing that, released too early, allowed the subject of it to control the narrative around it. Both reporters went to work. She could feel the momentum shifting in the way that momentum shifts when information moves from private to moving toward public, not yet irrevocable, but heading there with the steady logic of water finding its level. On the fourth day after the filing, Marcus called to tell her the court motion had been heard. The judge had granted a supervised inspection order. The transit authority's lawyers had argued that the facility was an active infrastructure asset requiring internal authorization for any access, which Marcus had countered with the authorities' own decade-long classification of the site as decommissioned and active. The judge had been particularly interested in that discrepancy. She'd granted the order and required the transit authority to provide access within 72 hours under supervision of a federal inspector assigned by the National Archives. Cara sat down when she heard this, not from shock, from something that felt closer to the particular relief of a weight held for a long time being set down at last. Marcus said, "You're going in on Friday. The National Archives inspector will be there. I'll be there. The transit authority will have a representative present. You have the right to have one additional witness of your choosing." She called Vernon Spade. He said yes before she'd finished explaining what she was asking. He said he'd be there with his walker if he had to be. He was not using a walker. She understood the sentiment. She also called Ellen Marsh that evening. She told her about the inspection order. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the careful voice of someone who'd spent years managing the space between hope and disappointment, "Let me know what you find." Cara said she would. Thursday night, she laid out her kit on the kitchen table. Headlamp, backup flashlight, camera, legal pad, the copy of the transfer confirmation, the copy of Marsh's 18G authorization document, her original inspection photographs, printed and organized in the order she'd taken them. She checked everything twice, then packed it all into her bag with the precision she brought to Meridian jobs, everything in its place, nothing unnecessary. Marco watched her from the kitchen doorway in his pajamas. He said, "Where are you going tomorrow?" She said, "Back to that tunnel I was working on. There's something important down there that needs to be documented properly." He said, "Is it treasure?" She looked at him standing in the doorway with his rumpled hair and his too big pajama top that had been a hand-me-down from Mrs. Vega's grandson and said, "I think so. I'm going to find out for sure tomorrow." He thought about this seriously the way he thought about everything that interested him. Then he said, "I hope it's something good." She said, "Me too, baby." She tucked him in. She sat on the edge of his bed for a few minutes after he fell asleep, looking at the glow stars on his ceiling. They were barely visible now, just the ghost of green against the plaster. She had told herself for months that she'd replace them when she had a little more room in the budget. She was going to replace them. Friday morning arrived bright and cold, the kind of autumn day that made the city look clean and deliberate. She was at the Transit Authority Maintenance Building by 8. Marcus was already there, in a coat that said he understood the significance of the occasion and had dressed accordingly. Vernon arrived 7 minutes later, moving carefully but steadily, wearing a Transit Authority jacket from his working years that he'd clearly kept pressed in a closet for 11 years. A woman in her 40s named Dr. Patricia Sue represented the National Archives, carrying a hard-sided case of documentation equipment and speaking in the measured tones of someone accustomed to being the most procedurally rigorous person in any room. Two Transit Authority lawyers stood to one side with the expressions of people who were present because they'd been ordered to be. Gerald was not at the desk. Hollis was. He was in person, more contained than his phone voice had suggested. A man in his early 60s who stood with the bearing of an administrator accustomed to holding the line on things. He looked at Cara when she came through the door, and his expression did not change, which was its own kind of communication. He handed her a set of keys in a sealed evidence bag. He said the Transit Authority was complying with the court order under explicit protest and reserved all rights regarding the status of the facility and any assets therein. He said this in a formal voice clearly prepared in advance. Marcus said thank you and began signing the access documentation. Dr. Sue unsealed her equipment case and began her own entry procedures. Vernon looked at Hollis for a moment, a steady and unhurried look. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They went in. The walk through the tunnel was different this time in every way that mattered. She'd walked it alone before, measuring her own position against a flawed map, moving through the quiet with her borrowed boots and her clipboard and the specific courage of a person who has decided to keep going without any guarantee of what going will produce. Now there were 5 people behind her, their footsteps combining into something that broke the tunnel's old silence properly, for what may have been the first time in decades. She found the bricked section without needing the map. She could have found it from memory. She worked the lock while Dr. Sue photographed her hands on the mechanism from 2 angles, and Marcus stood close enough to witness every movement. The heavy click of the barrel releasing felt the same as it had the first time, but different too. The difference between something done in secret and the same action done in the open, with witnesses, with legal authorization, with a woman from the National Archives documenting every second. The door swung inward. The cool air came out to meet them. The headlamps lit the tiled corridor, all 6 of them simultaneously, and the cream and brown geometric pattern caught all that light and gave it back exactly as Cara had seen it the first time. Dr. Sue made a sound that was not quite a word. Vernon stepped through behind her and stood in the tiled corridor and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I knew it. All those years. I knew there was something here." They went down the steps to the platform. No one spoke for a full minute. Cara had been here 3 times. She'd seen the platform and the benches and the service booth and the Harmon Street signs. She had descriptions of it in her own handwriting on her own legal pad. But seeing it again with these other people, watching their faces as they took it in, the intact vaulted ceiling and the tiled walls and the untouched station that had been waiting in the dark since 1944, she felt the weight of it differently. Dr. Sue was photographing methodically, moving along the platform with the focused efficiency of a professional who'd seen extraordinary things before and knew how to document them before anything else. Marcus stood at the center of the platform, looking toward the tunnel mouth where the locomotive waited. Vernon sat down on one of the wooden benches. He sat carefully, the way you might sit in a place you'd thought about for 40-some years. He put his hands on his knees and looked around the station, and then he looked at Cara and said, "You did good." She nodded and crossed to the north end of the platform, to the locomotive cab. The padlock on the cab door took her 12 minutes. The barrel was stiffer than the entrance lock, less maintained, and she had to work through the resistance slowly to avoid forcing it. Dr. Sue stood behind her with the camera running. When the lock opened and the cab door swung outward on its hinges, the air inside was different from the platform, closer, more concentrated, the specific atmosphere of a very small sealed space that had held the same air for a very long time. The logbook was on the shelf where she'd first seen it through the glass. She did not touch it. She stepped back and let Dr. Sue move in with gloved hands and document the book's position and condition before carefully lifting it and placing it in a preservation sleeve from her case. Dr. Sue opened the logbook on the cab's small instrument shelf, handling it with the practiced care of someone who worked with fragile historical documents regularly. The pages were brittle at the edges but intact, the handwriting inside clear and in good condition given the 8 decades of sealed storage. She read through the relevant entries while everyone waited. She read slowly, turning pages with gloved fingers, her expression neutral and professional. Then she stopped on a page near the back of the book and looked at it for a long moment. She said, "The manifest is here." The full accounting of what the 2 cargo cars contained had been logged by the Transit Authority liaison on October 14, 1944, in the precise and methodical handwriting of a person recording something they understood to be historically significant. The entry listed the contents of each car by crate reference number, quantity, and grade designation. It cross-referenced Program Directive 18G and listed the supervising federal agency official's name alongside the Transit Authority liaison's countersignature. The numbers were specific. Dr. Sue read them aloud in the quiet of the sealed station, and Marcus wrote them on his own legal pad, and the Transit Authority lawyers wrote them in their own notebooks, and Vernon sat on his bench at the far end of the platform and heard them and understood what they meant. Car 1, 748 crates. Each crate containing 2 standard Federal Reserve gold bars. 1,496 bars total. Car 2, 704 crates. Same specification. 1,408 bars total. Combined, 2,904 bars of Federal Reserve gold, grade 0. 99.99 fine, deposited into the Harmon Street Auxiliary Facility under Program Directive 18G on October 14, 1944. No record of removal. No record of retrieval. No record of any authorized access to the facility after the sealing date of November 17, 1944. Dr. Sue closed the logbook carefully and placed it back in its preservation sleeve. The station was very quiet. Even the sound of the city above, faintly present throughout, seemed to recede for a moment. Cara stood at the platform edge and looked at the two sealed cargo cars. 2,904 bars. At current market value, she had calculated the range, and Marcus had refined it through his own sources. $417 million on the low end of current spot price, $423 million on the high end, depending on the grade verification that would have to be done by federal assayers once the bars were actually accessed and tested. The Transit Authority lawyers had gone very still. She thought about Protocol 7. She thought about November 1944 and a man who'd signed a closure authorization and gone on to spend 2 decades on the Senate committees overseeing federal finance. She thought about Ellen Marsh sitting across from her in a house with overgrown gardens, the careful eyes of a person who'd been paying a price for someone else's secret for 9 years. She thought about Gorman telling his young engineer to forget about it and carrying the weight of that instruction for the rest of his working life and dying with it. She thought about $47. Dr. Sue was already on her phone, initiating the notification protocol that would bring in the full federal assessment team. The court order had specified that upon discovery of assets consistent with the claim, all further access and documentation would proceed under National Archives oversight with Treasury Department assayers present. This was the appropriate process. This was how it was supposed to work. Cara walked back down the platform to where Vernon was sitting and sat down beside him on the old wooden bench. He said, not looking at her, "My supervisor told me to let it go. I let it go." She said, "You came here today." He thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, his hands still on his knees, looking at the Harmon Street sign on the far wall. The federal assessment team arrived over the following days. Treasury assayers, National Archives documentation specialists, structural engineers to evaluate the condition of the facility and the cars. The Transit Authority, operating now under court supervision, had no choice but to facilitate access. Hollis did not appear again in person. His lawyers communicated through written correspondence that grew progressively less aggressive as the scope of what had been found was officially confirmed. The cargo cars were opened on a Wednesday, 12 days after the court order, with a full documentation team present and a federal supervisor overseeing every step. Cara was not permitted inside the cars during the official opening. That process belonged to the assayers. But she was on the platform, and she watched through the open door of Car 1 as the first crate was brought out and placed on the assessment table the federal team had set up and opened with proper tools by a woman in protective gear who did this work for the Treasury Department. The bar inside was exactly what the manifest said it would be. Standard Federal Reserve dimensions. The weight verified immediately on the portable scale. The grade stamp on the surface consistent with 1944 federal gold bar production. The assayer looked at it for a moment and then looked at her team lead and gave a single nod. Everything else that followed over the next 72 hours was documentation and process and the specific administrative machinery of a federal government confronting something it had buried and not retrieved. Cara spent most of that time at the Meridian Depot, on regular shifts, picking up Marco from school, making dinner, living her ordinary life, while something extraordinary was being confirmed 200 feet below the city. Marcus called her on Thursday evening with the assayer's preliminary findings. The count was consistent with the manifest. Every crate opened so far matched its logged contents. The grade verified at 0. 9,999 fine. The serial numbers on the bars cross-referenced against Treasury's own historical production records from 1944, records that had been classified for decades and were now, under the court order, being accessed for the first time in the context of this claim. He said, "It's real, Cara. All of it. The full count." She sat at her kitchen table and looked at the legal pad in front of her, at the pages she'd filled over the weeks since the first inspection, the dates and names and connections, and the question she'd written at the bottom of the first page. What happens to a person who finds something like this? She was starting to find out. The story broke publicly on a Saturday. Both journalists published simultaneously, the coordination Marcus had arranged with them from the beginning. The national piece covered the legal and historical dimensions, the wartime program, the deliberate obscuring of records, the 80-year gap between deposit and discovery. The local piece covered the human story. A maintenance subcontractor, a borrowed pair of boots, a discrepancy on a map that a different person would have walked past. The name on the 18G authorization appeared in the national piece, sourced to the document Marsh had provided and cross-referenced against Senate records and the Family Foundation's public filings. The senator had been dead for 12 years. His foundation remained active, managed by his adult children, and it became the subject of its own separate investigation within a week of the story publishing. An investigation into whether the foundation had any knowledge of or benefit from the continued concealment of the Harmon Street assets. That investigation was not Cara's to manage. She had enough of her own. The political dimensions of the story created a noise around it that she had not fully anticipated. The calls came through Marcus's office, which is where she directed everyone. Interview requests, television producers, a documentary team out of New York, legal firms offering representation in the asset recovery process, private collectors with questions about what would happen to the bars once they were assessed. Marcus handled all of it with the calm precision of someone who'd prepared for a large wave by making sure the ground beneath him was solid. What she had not anticipated was Hollis. He came to her apartment building on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the filing, alone, without lawyers. She saw him from the window before she opened the door, a man in his 60s standing on the sidewalk in a coat that was not the professional armor of the Transit Authority official she'd spoken to on the phone, but something closer to civilian clothes, the coat of a person not there in any official capacity. She went down and met him in the building entrance. He did not apologize. She had not expected him to. He said he'd been with the Transit Authority for 28 years and that he'd known about the Harmon Street facility for most of that time. Known in the way that people and organizations know things, through the institutional memory of closed files and restricted areas and questions that were redirected without explanation. He said he'd understood it to be a classified federal matter that was above his pay grade and outside his authority. He said he'd told himself that for 28 years. She listened. He said, "I called the woman. The professor. The one who was researching it. I told her it was classified. I told her the men who visited her were acting in accordance with the classification status. I believed that." He paused. "I also knew it served the Transit Authority's interests to have her stop asking questions. I've thought about that distinction since your filing." She said, "What do you want from me?" He looked at her steadily. He said, "Nothing. I wanted to say it to your face. What you found was real, and it should have been found a long time ago, and the people who prevented that didn't have the right to prevent it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for saying that." He nodded and walked away. She stood in the building entrance and watched him go and thought about the weight of things carried over decades and the particular courage it took to set them down. Ellen Marsh called her the same afternoon. She'd read both published pieces. Her voice was steadier than it had been in her living room, less guarded, carrying something that had not been there before. She said, "They're talking about reopening the research program. The university administration. Someone from the history department called me this morning. Cara said that was good." Marsh said, "I don't know if I want to go back." She was quiet for a moment. "But I'd like to write the account properly. The full history of the program, the ceiling, everything. I'd like to write it now that the documents are accessible." She paused. "Would you speak to me for it? For the record?" Cara said yes. The legal settlement took 4 months. It was not simple, and it was not quiet, and there were moments during the process when Marcus's calm professionalism was the only thing between Cara and the feeling that the institutional weight of the process was going to grind her position down to something unrecognizable. The Treasury Department's initial position was that the assets were federal property. Full stop. Their abandonment was not legally established, and the finder's claim was without merit. Marcus took that position apart document by document, argument by argument, in hearings that stretched over weeks. The core of his case was straightforward in principle, if complex in execution. The government had placed assets in a facility in 1944. It had then deliberately obscured all documentation of those assets. It had administratively removed the facility from its own records. It had failed to retrieve the assets over 80 years, during which time multiple opportunities to do so had arisen and been actively avoided. It had used institutional pressure to suppress inquiry by legitimate researchers. This was not administrative oversight. This was effective abandonment, combined with active suppression, and the legal doctrine governing that situation was clear. The congressional hearings that opened on the broader question of the 18G program's authorization chain and the subsequent concealment created a political context that made the Treasury Department's position increasingly difficult to hold. The senator's family foundation hired its own attorneys. The coverage expanded. The pressure on the federal agencies to reach a resolution that did not involve extended litigation over something that was increasingly visible to the public shifted the calculation. The settlement offer came on a Tuesday morning in March. Marcus called her before she'd left for her Meridian shift. He said, "They've agreed to a finder's allocation. Standard doctrine applied to the specific circumstances of effective abandonment as established in the record. She was going to receive 11% of the assessed value of the recovered assets, with an additional allocation for the costs incurred during the discovery and documentation process and a separate legal fee arrangement covered by the settlement terms." She said, "What does 11% come to?" He told her. She was standing in her kitchen in her borrowed boots with her bag over her shoulder and her legal pad on the table, and the eviction notice that had been extended twice and was now current but not forgotten. And she heard the number Marcus said and stood still for a moment. $46,380,000, plus legal costs and documentation expenses. She sat down on the kitchen floor, not from dizziness, from the specific weight of something enormous landing in a space that had been defined for years by smallness. She sat on the floor with her back against the cabinet and her bag beside her and her borrowed boots on her feet and held the phone. Marcus was quiet on the other end, giving her the moment. She said, "Is it final?" He said it required her signature and ratification by the Treasury Department's legal office, which he expected within 10 days. He said, the funds would be transferred to a trust account he'd established for her within 30 days of ratification. She thanked him. She meant it in a way that her voice could not fully carry. She sat on the kitchen floor for another few minutes after she hung up. Then she took off the borrowed boots and set them by the door. She went to her bedroom and found the pair she'd been meaning to buy since hers had split at the sole months ago, a pair she'd finally purchased 2 weeks earlier with a portion of the small advance Marcus had arranged against the anticipated settlement. She put them on. She called Dolores at the Meridian Depot and told her the boots had been returned to her front step. She said thank you. She called her mother's care facility and asked to speak to the billing department and told them the account would be paid in full, all outstanding balances, by end of the month. The woman in billing said she'd make a note. Her voice carried the professional neutrality of someone who'd heard promises before. Cara said, "I mean it." She meant it. She picked up Marco from school that afternoon. He came out of the building talking to a friend, the two of them deep in an argument about something that had happened at recess, and he didn't notice her immediately. She watched him from across the schoolyard. Her son, who'd been sleeping in the back of a car when she made the decision to apply to Meridian, who'd done his homework by flashlight and never complained, who'd told her the iron in the Earth's core was the same iron in their blood. He saw her and broke off his conversation and crossed the yard and fell into step beside her. She said, "How was school?" He said, "Fine." He thought about something for a moment. "Mom?" She said, "Yeah." He said, "That thing you were looking for in the tunnel. Did you find it?" She looked at him walking beside her, matching her pace the way he'd learned to do when she was moving with purpose. She thought about how to answer a question that held the whole last several months of her life inside it. She said, "I found it." He processed this. Then he said, "Is it enough?" She thought about what enough meant for a child who'd grown up understanding scarcity without ever being told about it directly, who'd learned the weight of his mother's concern from the quality of the silence between words rather than from any particular disclosure. She said, "More than enough." He nodded, satisfied with that. He went back to telling her about the recess situation as they walked home. She listened and walked and thought about what was coming. She thought about the care facility and paying the account in full and what her mother's face would do when she visited on Wednesday and told her. She thought about Marco's glow stars, which she'd already ordered a replacement set for, the better kind, the ones that were supposed to hold their charge for years. She thought about the legal pad on her kitchen table and the first question she'd written at the bottom of the first page. What happens to a person who finds something like this? She knew the answer now, or at least the beginning of it. What happened was not simple, and it was not clean, and it did not arrive as a single dramatic moment of transformation. It arrived the way all real change arrived, in the accumulation of individual days, each one slightly different from the one before, the margin in a life gradually widening until there was room in it for things that had previously been impossible. Room for her mother's care without counting the days until the cost became unmanageable. Room for Marco's school needs without the arithmetic of choosing between them. Room for borrowed boots to become a thing of the past rather than a standing condition of her life. Room for the glow stars to shine on his ceiling the way he deserved to have them shine. She also knew something she hadn't known when she stood in that corridor looking at a bricked wall that shouldn't have been there. She'd known the discovery was important. She hadn't known yet how important it would be to have made it herself. To have been the person who looked at the discrepancy and didn't walk past it. Who went back when the report was closed. Who sat on the corridor floor and thought instead of turning around. Who found the lock and learned to open it, and stepped through into the dark and did not flinch. There were people in her life who'd written the statistics for her before she'd had a chance to write her own story. She thought about all of them without bitterness, the way you thought about weather that had passed. The money would change the material conditions of her life. She understood that and did not pretend otherwise. It was real and it mattered. But what she'd found in that tunnel was not only the gold. She'd found the thing her grandmother had described as almost frightening, her own capacity for precision and patience, and the refusal to stop before the thing was done. That was hers before the settlement. It would be hers after. Ellen Marsh published her account of the Harmon Street program 18 months later, a book that drew on the documents that were now publicly accessible following the Treasury Department's resolution of the classification status. She thanked Cara in the acknowledgments as the person whose refusal to accept a closed item made the full history possible. She thanked Vernon Spade as a witness whose integrity outlasted the institutional pressure placed on it decades earlier. The book was reviewed well and was studied in several university history programs. Vernon came to the book launch, which was held in a small venue near the university. He wore the same transit authority jacket from his working years that he'd worn to the station on the day of the inspection. He stood with a glass of water and talked to people who asked him questions and answered them in the measured way he had. Not dramatizing, not minimizing, just describing what he'd seen and what he'd done and what he hadn't done and why he was glad the record was now complete. Cara came with Marco, who was 8 by then and had been told an age-appropriate version of the whole story over several conversations across the months it had taken for things to resolve. He had listened to each installment with the seriousness he brought to subjects that caught his interest and had asked questions that were, occasionally, better than questions adults were asking. At the book launch, he stood next to Vernon and looked up at him and said, "You're the one who found the door first." Vernon looked down at him. He said, "Your mother's the one who opened it." Marco thought about this. He said, "You both did the important part, though. You both noticed." Vernon looked at Cara over the boy's head with an expression that was as close to being undone as a man of his particular reserve would allow himself to get. She nodded at him. He nodded back. She had replaced the glow stars on Marco's ceiling by then. The new ones worked properly, charging through the day and releasing their light slowly through the night. The room above him soft and green when she stood in the doorway in the dark. She'd painted the ceiling herself on a Saturday in October, a pale blue that made the stars look like they were hanging in actual space rather than pressed against plaster. Marco had helped with the lower section, his roller leaving streaks she'd smoothed out after he fell asleep. The apartment was the same apartment. She had thought, briefly, about moving somewhere larger and more expensive. But Marco's school was here, and Mrs. Vega was here, and the bus routes she knew were here, and the Meridian Depot was here. She'd bought the apartment instead of renting it, bought it outright, which was the first morning in her adult life she'd woken up knowing that no eviction notice could come under her door. The Meridian work she still did sometimes. Not for the money, for the tunnels, for the specific quality of attention that the work required, for the way it felt to move through the underground with a clipboard and a headlamp, reading what was there rather than what was supposed to be there. Old habit, good habit. On a Thursday morning 6 months after the settlement, she went back to the Transit Authority maintenance building one more time. Not for an inspection. The Harmon Street facility was now under the administration of the National Archives, the station preserved as a historical site, pending full documentation. Dr. Seuss' team was managing access, and the process was thorough and well-funded. Gerald was back at the morning desk. He looked up when she came in, and recognition crossed his face, the recognition of a person who'd seen someone become a news story and was deciding how to treat the person now that the news story was behind them. She said good morning. She asked if she could take one more look at the entry log from her original inspection dates, just for her own personal record. He said he'd have to make a copy rather than let her handle the original. She said that was fine. He made the copy and handed it over without any ceremony. She thanked him and left. She folded the copy into her bag. She had no practical need for it. The legal record was complete, and in Marcus's files, and in the National Archives, and in Ellen Marsh's book, and in the public court documents. The entry log was simply a piece of paper with her name on it, and a date, and a check-in time, and a key number. The most ordinary possible record of the morning. She walked into a tunnel and changed the direction of her life. She kept it in a folder in her desk drawer at home, beside the legal pad with its pages of notes, beside the eviction notice she'd held onto for reasons she hadn't fully articulated even to herself. Reminders, not of hardship specifically, of the distance between that morning and this one, and what had crossed the distance between them. She walked home from the Transit Authority building in the thin winter sunlight, her proper boots on her feet, her bag over her shoulder, the city moving around her in its ordinary way. Below the street she walked on, the Harmon Street Station sat quiet and documented and no longer secret. Its sealed history now open to the kind of careful study that was the appropriate response to a thing that had been hidden for too long. The train was still at the platform. The cars had been emptied under federal supervision and the gold transferred to a secure federal facility for the long administrative process of accounting and classification that followed. The station itself remained, the benches and the Harmon Street signs, and the tiled walls and the service booth with its ribbed glass. The coat and keys still on the hooks. The logbook properly preserved and archived. The platform empty now of everything except the evidence of a history that had refused, in the end, to stay buried. Someone with the patience to notice. Someone willing to go back when the door was officially closed. Someone who understood that a discrepancy on a map was not a clerical error to be walked past, but a question requiring an answer, and who was willing to keep asking until the answer came. The city moved above it, unaware of most of this, busy with its own ordinary Thursday. And Cara Morales walked home through the winter light, her boys' school pickup an hour away, her mother's next visit on Sunday. The rest of her life opened out ahead of her like the platforms of a station finally uncovered, finally seen, finally entered without having to hide. Her mother cried only once during the conversation, and it was not at the part Cara expected. She'd gone to the care facility on a Wednesday afternoon in April, 3 weeks after the settlement ratification, bringing flowers from the market 2 blocks from the facility, because her mother always said cut flowers were a waste of money, which meant she secretly liked them. She'd sat in the chair beside the bed and waited until her mother had arranged the flowers in the plastic pitcher that served as a vase, and had asked twice whether Cara had eaten, and had settled back against the elevated pillows with the expression of a woman ready to be told something. Cara told her everything. She'd been telling her pieces of it for months, careful pieces, calibrated not to raise hope that might not materialize into anything solid. But the settlement was ratified now, and the money was in the trust account, and there was nothing left to be careful about. She started at the beginning, the way she always started things, and went through it in order. Her mother listened the way she'd always listened, with her hands folded and her eyes steady, the particular quality of attention she'd developed over a lifetime of receiving news that required her to stay calm enough for 2 people. She did not interrupt. She asked one question when Cara described the weight of the crate she'd moved, a quiet question about whether Cara had been safe down there alone, and accepted the answer and let Cara continue. When Cara told her the settlement number, her mother said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandmother would have said that was too much for one person." She said it not as criticism, but as the exact truth. Her mother had known Cara's grandmother, had in fact been quietly afraid of her in the way you were afraid of people whose moral standards operated at an altitude you could see but not quite reach. Cara said, "I know. I've been thinking about that." Her mother looked at her. She said, "What are you going to do with it?" And Cara told her some of what she'd already decided, the specific and practical things. The care facility account paid in full and secured for as long as it needed to be. The apartment purchased, Marco's education accounted for from here forward regardless of what happened to any other variable in their lives. These were the decisions that were already made, and she described them in the same plain way she described everything, without drama, as facts. Her mother listened to all of this without crying. Then Cara said, "I looked up the other families. The ones who used the care facility's financial assistance program to be here. There are 11 of them right now. I'm going to cover the gap. Whatever the assistance program doesn't reach. For as long as it's needed. Her mother looked at her for a long moment, and then her face did the thing it almost never did. The thing Cara had seen perhaps 6 times in her life. A giving way. A release of the careful composure that was her mother's most practiced skill. She pressed her lips together and looked at the cut flowers in their plastic pitcher and was quiet for a little while. Then she said, "I raised you right." Cara said, "You raised me exactly right." She stayed until dinner. They ate together from the facility trays that were actually not terrible. Her mother's standard complaint about institutional food temporarily suspended. They talked about Marco and about a television series her mother had been watching with one of the other residents, and about the flowers, which her mother assessed with the critical appreciation of someone who'd decided to stop pretending not to want them. When Cara left, she sat in her car in the facility parking lot for 10 minutes before she started the engine. Not crying, just sitting, allowing the afternoon to settle around her the way an extraordinary day settled when you'd been moving through it with too much focus to feel its full weight. She thought about what her mother had said. Not the "I raised you right," though that had landed somewhere permanent in her chest. The part about her grandmother. Too much for one person. She'd been thinking about that longer than she'd told her mother. She'd been thinking about it since the number was first confirmed, since the moment she'd understood the full scope of what the settlement represented. $46 million was not a personal fortune she'd earned through skill or effort alone. She'd found it. She'd been the person who looked closely enough to notice and stubborn enough to keep looking, and that mattered. It was real. She was not going to pretend it was luck when it was something else. But the thing she'd found had been placed there by other people, taken from somewhere, sealed away by decisions made before she was born. It carried a history that was not hers alone. What she did with it would say something about what she understood that history to mean. She was still working out exactly what that looked like. The 11 families at the care facility were a beginning, not a plan. She had time to build the plan carefully, the way she built everything, piece by piece until the structure could hold weight. She started the engine and drove home. The Harmon Street Station opened to the public on a Saturday in early June, 16 months after the court order, under the administration of the National Archives in partnership with the city's Historical Preservation Office. The opening was a small ceremony by public event standards, maybe 200 people, held on the platform itself. The space finally lit properly by temporary lighting the installation team had rigged along the vaulted ceiling. The light on the tiles was extraordinary. Cara had seen the station in the focused beam of a headlamp, which was the kind of light that showed you what you were looking for, and not much else. In full illumination, the cream and brown geometric pattern resolved into something she hadn't fully appreciated before, a design that was not merely functional, but genuinely considered. The work of someone who'd understood that people spending time underground deserved beauty as much as anyone traveling anywhere else. The tiles ran from floor to ceiling in an unbroken pattern, and the mosaic band at the upper edge, the black and white one she'd noted in her original documentation, was a stylized representation of the city's transit network as it had existed in 1943, the routes drawn in miniature along the wall like a long and very specific map of a city mid-century. Marco saw this before she did. He was 9 now, taller in the way children grew between the time you were watching them carefully and the time you looked up and noticed, and he pressed close to the wall to follow the miniature routes with his finger, tracing the lines of a transit system, most of which no longer existed in the same form. He said, "Is this the whole city?" She said, "The way it was then, 80 years ago." He followed one particular line to where it terminated at a small mark on the mosaic, a circle with 2 letters inside it, H and S. He pressed his finger to it. He said, "That's us. That's this station." She looked at the mark on the wall of a station she'd found by noticing a discrepancy on a map, in a tunnel she'd accessed with a borrowed key and a maintenance subcontract. In borrowed boots on a morning, she'd had $47 to her name. She looked at the mark and thought that it had been there the whole time, the station recording its own existence on its own wall, for anyone who made it inside to see. She said, "That's us." Dr. Seuss spoke at the opening ceremony, covering the historical significance of the site with the authority of someone who'd spent months inside its documentation. She described the wartime program, the deliberate sealing, the decades of administrative erasure. and the circumstances of the rediscovery in language that was precise and thorough, and that gave Cara's name the appropriate proportion of credit without turning her into a symbol at the expense of the history itself. Ellen Marsh sat in the front row and took notes in the margin of her program. Vernon sat beside Cara. He wore the Transit Authority jacket again. When Dr. Sue mentioned his name as one of the people whose testimony had been essential to the legal case, he nodded once and looked at his hands and did not otherwise react, which was exactly the reaction Cara would have predicted. After the ceremony, when the crowd was moving through the station in small groups and the temporary lighting was doing its work on the tiles, and people were pausing at the service booth to look through the ribbed glass at the register still inside, Marco found the bench. The specific bench. The one Cara had sat on after she'd first opened the cargo car wall, when the weight of what she'd found had settled on her in the quiet of a station that didn't officially exist. He sat on it with the unconscious ease of a child who did not yet know the full weight of every significant place he entered. He looked up at the vaulted ceiling, and then at the Harmon Street sign, and then at his mother standing a few feet away watching him. He said, "You sat here." She said, "How did you know?" He said, "You told me you sat down after you found it. And this is the only bench that faces the train cars." She looked at her son, this boy who'd done his homework by flashlight and grown into someone who paid attention to the geometry of rooms, who understood that the position of a bench said something about what a person sitting on it had been looking at. She sat down beside him. They sat together on the bench in the fully lit station with the people moving around them, looking toward the north end where the locomotive still waited, the cargo cars long emptied, and their welded banding removed, the doors now standing open on the empty dark interiors. The train was staying. The National Archives had made that determination early. It was part of the site, part of the history, part of what you needed to see to understand what the station had held and why the holding had mattered. Marco said, "Were you scared when you first came down here?" She thought about the honest answer to that. She said, "I was very focused." Scared was underneath the focus somewhere. But the focus was louder. He thought about this. He said, "That's probably good. If you'd been scared first, you might not have kept going." She looked at the locomotive at the platform edge, dark and still and permanent, and thought about the first time she'd seen it emerge from the shadow at the edge of her headlamp. The shape of something enormous and unexpected appearing in a space where it had been hiding in plain sight for 80 years. She said, "Yeah, probably." What she did with the rest of the money took shape over 2 years, not in a single decision, but in the accumulation of specific choices that added up to something she hadn't named until it was already underway. She funded 2 full scholarships annually at the community college Marcus attended when she'd been building her maintenance certifications, specified for students who were primary caregivers, working parents, people doing their education alongside the other impossible demands of a life that did not pause for class schedules. She did this quietly, through the college's financial aid office, without her name attached to it. She bought the building where her apartment was, not to raise the rents. She told the property manager, who was briefly confused by this plan, that the existing tenants would stay at existing rates and any future vacancy would be filled by the same process. The property manager said this was not standard practice for a building owner. She said she understood that. She established a relationship with a career counselor who worked with people aging out of foster care in the city, the population she'd come from, and funded a small case management program that helped the transition between placement and independence, the specific gap that had made her first years with Marco so precarious. It was not a large program. It served 40 to 50 people a year. She thought about those numbers sometimes in terms of the specific difference between 40 people who had support during the hardest transition of their lives and 40 people who did not, and the arithmetic was not complicated. She still worked occasionally for Meridian. Not the full schedule, not the way she had when she needed the hours to cover the rent. She took the jobs she wanted, the ones in the older sections of the network, the tunnels with the interesting inconsistencies, the places where the city's infrastructure showed its age in ways that required careful reading. She still carried her headlamp. She still brought her clipboard. She still measured things that didn't add up. She had not found another Harmon Street. She had not looked for one. What she'd found the first time was not a treasure map to other discoveries. It was one specific discovery made by one specific person in one specific moment of refusing to let a discrepancy pass. The work itself was the thing that mattered. The attention. The refusal to accept a closed item as a settled question. She taught Marco to do inspections, or the version of it that a 9-year-old could do, which was mostly about learning to notice when something did not match its description and asking why instead of moving on. They practiced in the apartment building, identifying where the floor plan description in the building documents did not quite match the rooms as she actually measured them. The building was not hiding anything. It had just been renovated twice without updated documentation, which was entirely ordinary, but the skill of noticing was the same. He was good at it. She was beginning to understand, the same quality she'd been told her own grandmother had described as almost frightening. The capacity to look at something until it told you what it was actually made of. She was not in a hurry to know where that would take him. She had learned from the tunnel work that you did not arrive at the thing by rushing toward it. You arrived by moving carefully and paying attention and being willing to go back when the first pass missed something. He had time. He had all the time that came with a childhood where the material precarity had finally been lifted, where the glow stars on the ceiling charged through the day and held their light through the night, where dinner was reliable and school fees were paid, and the person who loved him most was not dividing her attention between his needs and the arithmetic of whether the numbers would reach the end of the month. She thought about that sometimes when she was in the tunnels, the particular quality of time that opened up in a life when scarcity stopped organizing every hour of it. It was not something she'd fully felt yet. She expected it would take longer than she thought to stop waiting for the problem that would require everything she had to manage. Old habits of attention did not dissolve quickly, but the waiting was less constant now. The space between moments of it was wider. On a Thursday evening in November, 2 years after the settlement, she sat at the kitchen table with her legal pad, not to document something in progress, not to track a chain of events toward an uncertain outcome. She'd picked it up because she still liked the feel of it, the specific smell of paper that had accumulated months of notes, the record of a thing that had happened and was now complete. She turned to the last page she'd written on. The date from the evening Marcus had called to confirm the filing. Below it, in her own handwriting, filed. Legal clock started. What happens next happens in the open. She turned to a fresh page after that. She thought for a moment. Then she wrote the date at the top, the way she always started, and below it wrote a single line. The glow stars still work. Everything else is being figured out. She closed the pad and left it on the table and went to check on Marco, who was asleep with his arm over his head and his mouth slightly open and the ceiling above him soft and green with the light of stars that held their charge. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she turned off the hall light and went to bed in a home that was hers, in a life that was still becoming itself, in a city that moved above its own buried history every day, mostly without knowing, occasionally without forgetting, and now, in at least one sealed station converted to a public record, no longer pretending it was not there. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.